Yes. Okay, we're going to get started. 2 minutes after 1, we have a quorum. Welcome to the Education, Energy, Environment Committee. And we are going to start our bill hearings today with Senator Mouts on Senate Bill 1048. Senator Mouts, welcome back. You become a regular in this committee, and that's a good thing. So you are the lone witness on this bill, and you take the time you need to present Senate Bill 1048.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. It's a great honor to be here with you today to present Senate Bill 1048. I want to set a record in the fastest bill hearing and hopefully the most convincing. The legislation before you, Senate Bill 1048, is intended to clarify an ambiguity, and that ambiguity has occurred after shoreline stabilization projects have been implemented. Case law shows that landowners who implement shoreline stabilization projects own the land that's been restored or been stabilized. With living shorelines, oftentimes a shoreline is eroded. There is a restabilization, and there's a little bit of land that is returned. That's land that has gone into the water. However, when these permits, when a shoreline stabilization permit is issued, I'm going to read from you what the standard condition states. It says the licensee acknowledges that this license does not transfer any property interest in state tidal wetlands. This license allows the licensee to use state tidal wetlands only for the structure or activity authorized herein, and in no way limits the use of waters of the state by the public. I expect that you're going to see opposition from the Department of Environment. In reality, the way this plays out, and I've got a great demonstration right here in this committee room, and a shoreline that's eroding, say this is the shoreline, and the desk before me erodes into the water, we'll say the Chesapeake Bay. And the landowner who would like to restore that shoreline is required to implement a living shoreline. So they'll install a row of stone, a barrier. They'll fill this area that has eroded, and then the landowner will install another row of stone to create the environment for the living shoreline. So this area that had been eroded, that is now returned, according to this permit, is no longer the property of the landowner. Now, this is a small example. These projects range anywhere from 60 to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the length and the size. Oftentimes, this is a huge impediment for landowners that are looking into whether or not they're going to invest that amount of money to restore their shoreline without knowing they're even going to actually own that shoreline in fee simple. It's a nuanced question. It is not, there is not a crisis before us at this moment. However, it is something that comes up in my daily course of constituent services dealing with living shoreline projects. The case law, as you will see from the testimony submitted by the representative from the Surveyors Association, Mr. Bowers, goes through and explains where the courts have ruled on this. That being said, the permit that the landowners receive when they apply for these projects explicitly state that the landowners don't own the land. So if you're going to invest in doing a living shoreline project, why would you do that if you know the only way you're going to have ownership is if you have to go to court to prove that ownership? This legislation would resolve that. I believe the courts have already resolved it, and I'd urge your favorable recommendation so we can clarify this ambiguity. Thank you.
Just one quick, since we're talking courts and lawyering and all that, there is a letter, putting aside MD, there is a letter, I don't know if you've seen, of opposition from the Maryland State Bar Property Section Council. I don't know if you've seen that, but at some point, maybe you take a look at it, and then, you know, if you want to, in some way, shape, or form, submit some supplemental written testimony or response, okay?
I would be happy to.
Okay. Yes, Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Mounts, for this legislation. Just wanted to ask you, because you and I have some similarities with our districts, and I often hear from constituents, and there just seems to be some confusion, number one, about this issue, and two, we want to motivate our constituents to be part of any restoration, especially if it means they're making that their own personal investment. Is that what's prompting this legislation to make clear that, you know, these property owners who are doing what's right by the environment, and also the fact that they're the property owners, would put this, you know, would just kind of clarify their investment?
Oh, I think it absolutely is an issue in the decision-making process of whether to invest money to stabilize a shoreline or not. I've talked to a number of constituents that have foregone those projects. One project entailed over it was a several $1 million shoreline restoration project. Of course, not everybody's looking at that type of deal, but we're talking a lot of shoreline that could have been restored, would have been restored, and is no longer above sea level. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for Senator Mounts? Okay, thank you. That concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 1048, which brings us to Senator McKay. Senator, we're on Senate Bill 837, and take the time to present your bill, and then we do have some unfavorables signed up after you that we'll bring up to the table after that. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and members of the committee. Senate Bill 837 is a local bill. Deep Creek Lake lower levels require an impact study. Now, Deep Creek Lake and the surrounding areas are often called the economic engine of Garrett County, and in many respects it is. The lake is important to the county, members of the delegation, and would not recommend any action that would jeopardize lake activities or many downstream benefits, including the whitewater rafting. Now, the Board of County Commissioners submitted a request to the delegation at a public meeting on November 21st, 2023. We shared draft copies with the Maryland Department of the Environment and Department of Natural Resources. From that public meeting, Senate Bill 837 was to provide valuable scientific information on potential management tools for controlling nuances in submerged aquatic vegetation, excess sediment in the shallow waters and coves and habitats. Managing both the nuisance and invasion aquatic vegetation and controlled sediment inputs to Deep Creek Lake are key goals to the 2016 Deep Creek Watershed Management Plan. This was approved and signed by the Board of County Commissioners. Now, Senate Bill 837 requires that the water level for the Deep Creek Lake be lowered for a period of time between November 30th and February 28th to enable the Maryland Department of Natural Resources or their contractors to conduct studies to determine the impacts of lowering the lake levels on the spread and growth of aquatic invasive plant species, as well as sediment deposits in the lake. Nothing in this proposed legislation is outside the current permit regulations for the operation of the dam and generation of power. In fact, the current permit allows for an emergency drawdown of waters without any penalty. Multiple literature studies suggest that exposing aquatic species to the cold winter temperatures during lake drawdown will inhibit the spread of vegetation. These studies proposed by Senate Bill 837 will help confirm that the case in the Deep Creek Lake. The lake water levels will be lowered within the rules of the Water Appropriation and Use Permit issued to Brookfield Power by the Maryland Department of Environment, and will not be lowered than the established lowered rule band of 2,455 feet for the winter months. Historically, Deep Creek Lake has recharged in the spring and has ample time for whitewater releases. Our community has supported and will continue to support the whitewater releases for rafting enthusiasts. My commitment to all stakeholders can be found in an amendment that has been drawn up and should be in your laptops, Amendment 333620/1. And it adds to the analysis of the impact of the lower lake levels on the whitewater industry to the study. Now, there is some ongoing Deep Creek Lake Arrowhead Cove dredging project involved the removal of accumulated sediment, as well as both native and potential nuisance aquatic species to help restore and maintain the lake as a healthy ecosystem and enhance the enjoyment of recreational usage. The dredging project will address the pros and cons of dredging and the viable management tool for migration of the accumulated sediment, and will establish a baseline for the impact of the study of the project to both native and invasive aquatic vegetation. Now, I do understand the need for the dam operators to maintain sufficient water levels to meet their contracted requirements. But there is also a requirement that the state of Maryland, as owners and stewards of the lake, research and evaluate best practices to control invasive aquatic species as well as mitigate sediment. The information obtained from this proposed four-year study will be extremely important for the next permitting cycle. I urge you to pass Senate Bill 837 with the amendment to include the whitewater industry. And I appreciate your consideration and urge a favorable report for Senate Bill 837.
Okay, thank you, Senator McKay. Any questions for the sponsor? Okay, yes, Senator Watson.
Thanks, Senator McKay. I've never heard of folks kind of drawing down a lake to do tests before. So two questions. One is there another way to conduct this, what seems like experiment or impact study to get the data that you need? And number two, where are other lakes that this is done?
So to answer your question for number one, for the over 75 years that Deep Creek Lake has been in existence, the band rule allows for the lowering of the lake for a variety of reasons. So the lake historically has been lowered. It isn't not until recently that the newer operators have not been lowering the lake as much as they have. I completely understand that there are financial constraints on them to provide a certain amount of electricity and guarantee. So we certainly want to work with them to find out a good place to do that. As you well know, Senator, there are no natural lakes in the state of Maryland. They're all man-made. And we actually have another bill that will look to the State Lakes Restoration Fund that will be coming up. That was a mandate that had an expiration date, had about $2 million that would go into it. The studies of the dredging projects that we've done for Deep Creek Lake has come from that funding. So to answer your question, we believe historically it can fill back where it needs to be. Also, when Deep Creek Lake was being created, I wasn't there, but my understanding is that they had they thought it would be 2.5 years for the lake to get to the level where it was. And my understanding was it was in 14 months they was able to get to the level that it needed. So that may be anecdotal, but I hope that has answered your question, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, any additional questions for Senator McKay? Senator Brooks, you look like you're about to push your button.
Yes, I was.
Okay.
Yeah, a question, Senator. Can you give me an example? I mean, I guess PGM, when they need to ramp up power and the lake is lower, what kind of problem would that cause for them?
Well, first of all, because the dam operator, Brookfield, is by requirement to provide X amount of power.
Right.
There are some penalties that they would incur if they were unable to actually bid. We do believe that the permit that was decided between the MDE and all of the stakeholders have created the band rule. And what we're talking about is within that band rule, within those, within the permit process. So everything that we're asking, they can do already. The question comes in is having it mandated or not. And one of the biggest reasons is the dredging project that I brought up. We were very thankful that Brookfield did work with the county to get to a point where we could do that dredging project, and that looks like it's going to be a positive. So we're looking to do more dredging projects like that, and we need to be able to plan as the county goes after grant money, as the state uses money in the State Lakes program. We need to be able to plan, and knowing that during this 4-year study, we'll know that the lake is being lowered to a particular level, and all the stakeholders will then be able to weigh in with the overall study for the next permitting process.
All right, okay, thanks.
Thank
Chair.
you, sir.
Okay, Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Senate sponsors still trying to understand this issue, but I noticed that you were very specific on the time frame, which seems pretty narrow in scope. But can you comment on that time frame in the legislation?
Well, my understanding is that the reason that we picked those times was to make sure that there are other stakeholders that use with the discharge of the actual water from the dam, the whitewater community. We believe that during that time, the lake will be able to recharge to its point that it won't affect them. We also took into consideration the coldest period for Garrett County. And so one of the benefits of the lake levels going down is that vegetation that is along the shoreline will do a couple things. People talk about how they used to be able to swim in the coves. They can't do that now. People used to talk about that they didn't have to pull up the engines in their boats to actually park the boat in front of their particular property. And now, because this vegetation has grown, both native and invasive, and by lowering the lake levels, the winter months, the coldest time during that period, will actually be able to burn out that vegetation. And one of the best things about that is it doesn't introduce chemicals into the lake as residents who might be trying to take care of that. So we firmly believe that whether it be for boating, whether it be for swimming, or maybe it's your watch that you left and dropped in the lake, but the lower levels come down, you might be able to find your watch or your ring, something like that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, Senator.
Yes, any additional questions for the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're gonna go next to a panel of unfavorables. I'll just list the names and you can come up to the witness table. Prusha Hassan, Dustin Droge, Spencer Schlossnagel, Jess Whitmore, and Brett Leininger. There's 5 witnesses, 5 seats table, and you have a seat. Do you have a sequence? Do you have this organized, or should I pick who goes first?
It's okay.
Okay. Okay, why don't you push the mic, bring the mic over and put it close, and you will lead off, and each of you will be on the 2-minute clock. Okay, so you'll see a timer up there. Okay, why don't you start and tell us who you are?
All right. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and members of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee. My name is Prusha Hassan. I'm the Manager of State Policy at Brookfield Renewable US and a proud Marylander. While Brookfield Renewable supports efforts to improve the health and safety of Maryland's waterways, we are concerned that this proposal does not consider the merits of the existing processes and could have unintended consequences for communities and businesses. In Maryland, Brookfield Renewable's 20-megawatt Deep Creek hydropower facility provides carbon-free power, local tax revenues, and recreational opportunities, along with both direct and indirect jobs in Garrett County. This bill will severely impact our operations and imposes risks on our Deep Creek facility and the benefits it provides to the community. While we support efforts to preserve the health of Deep Creek, there is little evidence to suggest that lower lake levels will create that result. In 2022, the Deep Creek Watershed Foundation released its own 3-year study outlining the water drawdown efficacy, the findings showed no clear benefit for this level of drawdown. Since this review, there has been no material changes that would provide the rationale for legislation to unilaterally bypass robust permitting processes currently in existence. We urge the legislature to consider the potential consequences of lowering the water band, including impacts to downstream fish comfort requirements, recreational boating, and the whitewater rafting community. This bill would harm our ability to uphold our regulatory and stakeholder obligations, but perhaps most importantly, it hinders our ability to provide an essential service in ensuring that clean, reliable power is delivered to homes and businesses throughout the region. Lowering the water band jeopardizes our ability to inject maximum power into PJM during critical winter months where outages and extreme weather events are more frequent. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we'll go down the table, sir?
Yes, good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Dustin Dregge, and I am the Director of Operations at Brookfield Renewable US, the owner and operator of Brookfield Power Piney and Deep Creek LLC. I'm here today because Senate Bill 837 is a risk to my business and the many stakeholders that it serves. The Maryland Department of the Environment has a water appropriation and use permit process that aims to conserve, protect, and use water resources in the best interest of the people of Maryland. The process for our current permit started in February of 2019 and concluded a year and a half later in September of 2020. The permit allows us to withdraw water from Deep Creek Lake to produce clean, renewable electricity, as the lake was created to do. Stakeholder discussions were held between approximately 18 stakeholder groups at the time, including Brookfield and various private, public, and government entities. Through the permitting process, a consensus was reached at the time that current operating bands and winter drawdown elevations were sufficient to meet the needs of all parties. The permitting process is designed to give ample opportunity for all stakeholders to voice their needs and concerns and is meant to strike a balance between them, and it did. Senate Bill 837 is being proposed by one stakeholder group as a means of skirting the permitting process and preventing other stakeholders from having their voices heard. This bill will cause undue risk to downstream uses of the water and have little, if no positive impact on the lake, as was demonstrated in the study that was conducted 2018 to 2020.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Leininger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Brett Leininger here testifying on behalf of Brookfield. Really appreciate, I did have an opportunity to meet with Senator McKay, appreciated his time. Also appreciate the amendments. However, the amendments still have the mandate in the bill as I understand them. And for the reasons that we stated, we have a lot of competing interests in this matter. Went through an exhaustive stakeholder process. There was reference to the Arrowhead Cove Point project. I think it's been stated in some kind of communications to the community that Brookfield is refusing to do anything. The fact of the matter is it took some time. It's an exhaustive process. And the Maryland Department of Environment is heavily involved, as was discussed with respect to the permit. We have PJM considerations, and it does take time. And we came to terms that would enable that project to move forward. To just mandate, and I understand and appreciate the senator's attempts to keep it within the bands, but there are a number of considerations within that band. Winter Storm Elliott in 2022 was an example where we were tasked with providing power, and his hydroelectric facility is baseload power that can be turned on really fast and is needed. So if there is a conversation, we're ready, willing, and able to continue conversations with all the stakeholders without the mandate in place to find a path forward. That path forward, however, would require some flexibility on the part of the MDE, which would be an extensive conversation. So we appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, respectfully in opposition, but also, again, looking forward to further conversations.
Let's go through the whole panel and then we'll take questions. Sir, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is Spencer Slosny. I'm the mayor of Friendsville. I'm the mayor of a tiny town in Maryland. We're about a population of approximately 500 people, but we're proud of that population and we're proud of our community. Friendsville is the westernmost municipality in the state of Maryland. Took us a little over 3 hours to get here, but it was well worth coming down, and I look forward to coming back to our state capital. We are referred to as the wild and scenic adventure capital of Maryland because of our Class 5 river we have, the Occoganey, that flows right through the town of Friendsville. We have numerous businesses that are coming into our town. We were gifted a 4-acre parcel of land for the boaters and rafters, for the rafters that come into our community, our town. So as Deep Creek Lake grows and has people coming in, so does Friendsville, is our economic hub. We have a Kendall Trail. People go hiking on that. So many people may go whitewater rafting or kayaking. Other folks go on the trail or go biking and hiking around our community. We love our little town, and we're very grateful for what Senator has added to the amendment, but we're still concerned. Deep Creek Lake has 69 miles of shoreline around that. So to lowering that level, that would not help Friendsville. We have over 60 release days throughout the season that the rafting companies come in here, and there's over 6 companies that travel into Friendsville. We have more Airbnbs than our other 7 municipalities, including Friendsville together, that our people are coming into our town and want to stay in Friendsville because of that benefit. So I encourage you to please consider this Bill 837 to vote against this for this reason. The River Liaison is Jess Whitmore, a former council member who's here with me, and he'll be speaking as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you pass it to the councilman?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Jess Whittemore, and I have lived in the town of Friendsville for over 44 years from Ellicott City. I served on the town council for a combined 20 years, and the present council trusted me with their economic river liaison for this and many other river issues. The town of Friendsville is against the passage of SB 837. Friendsville would appreciate an unfavorable committee report. And for the following reasons. It could be easily have a negative effect on Whitewater Dam releases, as the dam operator, Brookfield Renewable Power, and MDE have made clear to us, especially on spring drought years. Friendsville highly values the economic and social benefits of whitewater releases. We depend on the scheduled whitewater releases for tourism and our growing population of whitewater enthusiast citizens. Risking the uninterrupted schedule is highly undesirable. Deep Creek Lake Watershed Foundation requested a Brookfield permit change with MDE. The foundation permit change requested lacked evidence to support the study that required a 1-month low level in the lake. MDE denied the foundation's request for lack of evidence. If MDE found that the request had merit, they would have asked all Deep Creek Lake stakeholders for input, which never happened. It appears that the foundation circumvented MDE and solicited local politicians to intervene. This resulted in the creation of SB 837 without full Deep Creek Lake stakeholder participation or consideration, including the town of Friendsville. I found out about this just 7 days ago. SB 837 circumvents the respectful, lawful, and thoughtful review of Brookfield's permit impact, as well as impact on other Deep Creek Lake stakeholders, including Friendsville, that Maryland review process would have afforded us. Friendsville would appreciate an unfavorable committee report. Thanks for hearing me.
Okay, thank you. You did invoke Ellicott City, so we're going to start. Senator from Ellicott City, Senator Hester.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to just reflect briefly on the DNR letter of information, and then I have a question for Brookfield. I mean, DNR states that they're charged with maintaining a balance of ecological and recreational value in Deep Creek Lake, and it's difficult to maintain fully where one use may impact another. And furthermore, recreational value includes many different types of recreation, including boating, fishing, water skiing, hunting, photography, blah, blah, blah. but then they go on to say that, that per the MDE issued water appropriation permit to constrain the level of the lake between 246 feet to 2,461 feet and 2,455 feet. And during the winter months, the lake is maintained, at 2,455 feet. So recent history has demonstrated that Brookfield Power prefers to maintain the lake level at the higher levels of the permitted levels. And so if there's kind of historical, precedent for Brookfield to maintain it at the higher levels, my question is, have you, attempted to work with, the bill sponsored other stakeholders to solve kind of the issue and consider if there's like maybe other ways in this bill, like maybe slight tweaks to it where we could achieve a kumbaya moment? Because it seems like that hasn't happened, recently.
Yes, thank you for your question, Senator. So to answer it directly, we found out about the bill approximately a week ago, and we did not have any contact from any of the folks involved in making this bill until very recently. So until today, I hadn't had a discussion with Senator McKay. So as Brett had alluded to earlier, we are open to discussions. However, the way that we operate the lake today is intended to ensure that we can meet all of our stakeholder obligations and balance them, as you pointed to earlier.
So you're willing to have further conversations and try to achieve a solution?
So we're definitely willing to have conversations.
Thank you very much.
The only thing I would add is that MDE will have to weigh in significantly because it's the permitting requirements or what was just approved not too long ago. So that's one of the major factors that we have to take into consideration.
Can I add to that?
Okay, how about one final thought, and then we're gonna go to Senator Brooks, and we want to get to Chair Smith's bill next. Okay, go on, sir.
Okay. MDE holds these stakeholder meetings where if there's a question between stakeholders, they send it off into their scientists and hydrologists and mathematicians, which the whole building's full of, and they come up with factual, ways to work together. And so the stakeholder group without them is very difficult because we don't have the resources that they do. So I would say that MDE is having circumvented MDE in this whole thing is a real problem.
Okay, Senator Brooks, and then we can loop back to Senator Hester.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Either Brett or Dustin, either the two. Dustin, you mentioned that this would cause tremendous harm to your business. And then the sponsor is aware that there are some consequences for not meeting that demand with that contract with PJM. Could you elaborate a little deeper on what that would do to your business if you weren't able to deliver?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question, Senator Brooks. So the timeframe of the year that this bill is proposing to draw the lake down is, as we all know, a very critical time of the year for the grid. So in the winter, as we've seen with Winter Storm Elliott in 2022, which caused rolling blackouts in the TVA grid and also had implications for other areas of the United States, and as a result of that, a few power companies did file for bankruptcy. So this timeframe of the year is very sensitive for us as a business and us as a community. The reason being is that we need to have all of the resources available to respond in the event of a polar vortex or some other exigent event that can cause strain on the grid. And what happens if we don't respond to that is that we get penalized very heavily.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, back to you, Senator Hester.
I was just looking through the bill file and there's absolutely nothing from the Department of the Environment. And it'd be super helpful if the Department of Environment's listening for them to weigh in on the bill.
That's a very good suggestion. Okay, any additional questions for this panel? Okay. Seeing none, that concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 837. We're going to next go to Chair Smith on Senate Bill 405. And you've got 4 witnesses signed up to be part of your sponsor panel. If you want to bring them up, I've got Judith Fulton, Mark Sutherland, Lisa
Thank you.
Caprioglio, and Anaga Nambudiri. I may have botched that last name up, but those are the names signed up to be part of the sponsor panel, and actually those are the entirety of the witnesses for the bill. So, Mr. Chair, Senate Bill 405. Take it, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the distinguished EEE Committee, Senator Smith here to testify on behalf of Senate Bill 405, outdoor lighting standards and use of state funds, which would require the Maryland Building Council to develop standards and update their specifications for outdoor lighting with consideration of the latest information on light pollution, including color temperature recommendations of the American Medical Association. With this legislation, state funds would not be allowed to be used to install or replace permanent outdoor luminaries for lighting of any state building, facility, park, trail, or highway unless the luminaire is designed to maximize energy conservation and minimize light pollution, glare, and light trespass. The luminaire installed must have a correlated light temperature that is less than or equal to 3,000 Kelvin, a little flashback to our middle school and high school science class, which is the global recommendation from the Dark Sky International. Senate Bill 405 addresses light pollution in the state of Maryland and its contribution to higher energy consumption, disruption of sleep patterns in humans, wildlife disruption, and limitations on nighttime military training. Outdoor lighting can have detrimental effects on wildlife, human sleeping patterns, and energy consumption in Maryland. Senate Bill 405 is consistent with the goals of the Maryland Climate Reduction Plan by reducing electricity consumption of lighting fixtures across the state of Maryland. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge the committee to give a favorable report to Senate Bill 405. And I would mention that there are two amendments in your bill file. One is the Department of the Environment stated that they did not have the staffing to carry out the bill, so the responsibility has now been shifted to the Maryland Green Buildings Council under the Department of General Services. And amendment number 2, MDOT considered 3,000 Kelvin was too low. So this includes a provision that provides for a waiver. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee, I'd ask for a favorable report.
Okay, can you stick around for the panel? You're good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's go through the panel and then we can take some questions. Ma'am, why don't you introduce yourself again? You're going to be on a 2-minute clock, each of the witnesses. So why don't you start?
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and committee members. I'm Judy Fulton, a native and invasive species expert, and I'm here on behalf of the Maryland Sierra Club. We are in favor of Senate Bill 405. This is a good bill that will reduce light pollution, good for taxpayers, good for human health, and good for wildlife. This bill is a very modest expansion of our excellent 2011 law. The original requires state-funded outdoor lighting to be energy efficient and shielded. This bill covers more types of state-funded outdoor lighting, including highways, parks, and trails. This is a cost-effective approach. It only applies to projects for installing new or replacement light fixtures. It doesn't affect existing lights or maintenance. Efficient and shielded outdoor light fixtures don't cost more upfront, but they are cheaper to operate. Also, there's a waiver provision that provides flexibility. SB 405 follows best practices and puts Maryland on par with 14 states with similar statutes. From coast to coast and north to south, from New Hampshire to Texas, including our neighbors, Delaware and Virginia. Importantly, the bill adds a new provision to address the color of lighting based on the 2016 guidance from the American Medical Association. Warmer yellowish white light is better for human health and wildlife than colder bluish white light. Scientific studies in Maryland and elsewhere show that starker bluish white light at night messes people's sleep and is linked to heart disease, cancer, and obesity. It confuses beneficial insects like fireflies and night pollinating moths. Growing up, I remember catching jars full of fireflies. Besides the fun and beauty they bring us, they help control mosquitoes that spread disease. Now the Bethany Beach firefly is rated highly state rare, and other insect populations in Maryland are also dropping. This bill is a good step forward. The Maryland Sierra Club asks for your favorable report on SB 405.
Okay, your timing was perfect on that one. Sir, you're next.
I don't think I'll do as well, but I'll keep it under 2 minutes. So thank you, Chair Feldman.
Tell us who you are.
Yes, Yeah, thank you, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and members of the committee. I'm Dr. Mark Sutherland, representing Safe Skies Maryland and the Maryland Ornithological Society, which has 2,000 members across the state of Maryland. I hope that you will report favorably on this bill because artificial light at night is seriously bad for animals, including humans. The bill is an important step toward reducing the damaging effects of the wrong type of light in the wrong amounts and in the wrong places. So I'll just quickly mention three impacts. First, human impacts. As was mentioned, artificial light tends to delay sleep, misalign our circadian rhythms, and this can be caused by exceedingly bright lights from neighboring public facilities. Doing so has negative effects on our psychological, cardiovascular, and metabolic functions, and it is very likely that we are yet to understand all the negative effects of artificial lights on human health and welfare. With regards to birds, artificial light causes confusion, disorientation, and exhaustion in birds, directly impacting their ability to migrate. Migratory birds include everything from seabirds, ducks, geese, sandpipers, and songbirds of all kinds, and they can be attracted to artificial light as far as 5 kilometers away, which causes them to become disoriented, leading to exhaustion and fatal collisions with buildings, killing up to 1 billion birds a year in the United States. It also causes birds to nest earlier, up to a month, which can result in asynchrony between their nesting and their peak food availability. Artificial light and other impacts have reduced the U.S. bird population by 29% since 1970. Lastly, the insect apocalypse is upon us. Dramatic declines across the globe of beneficial insects are being reported on almost a daily basis. These insects become affected by artificial light by compromising their essential defensive behaviors. And fireflies, as been mentioned before, can no longer use their light blinking behavior. Therefore, they're not able to mate or pollinate flowers. So with that, I strongly encourage the committee to make a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let's go down the end of the table. Again, tell us who you are, and you have 2 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Capriolio. I am a resident of District 20, and I am submitting this testimony in support of Senate Bill 405, Development of Outdoor Lighting Standards. Thank you, Senator Smith, for sponsoring this bill. Excessively bright white lights on Long Branch Trail have negatively impacted my life every night since they were installed in January 2022. The new LED lights were 10 times brighter than recommended by the Illuminating Engineering Society, and the color temperature was significantly whiter than the recommended 2200 Kelvin. I could not sleep. The lights disrupt my body's circadian rhythms. I contacted Montgomery Parks requesting a change, and they emailed this response. Quote, "The recent upgrades of the lights are part of our routine maintenance efforts, and the lighting is the type used throughout our park system. The lighting is directed toward the trail in accordance with parks installation practices, and our staff has determined the lighting is appropriate for the need it serves. With these considerations in mind, the lights will not be altered." End quote. This is not limited to Montgomery Parks. New lights on the Carroll Avenue Bridge over Sligo Creek are bright white. New lights on Park Valley Bridge over Sligo Creek are bright white. This underscores the need for Senate Bill 405. Existing rules on outdoor lighting do not take current scientific standards into account. Staff with no special training make decisions regarding public health. Science must take precedence over intuition. I request a favorable report on Senate Bill 405.
Okay, let's go to our final witness.
Good morning. My name is Annika Nambudiri, and I am a sophomore at Northwest High School. I'm also a policy deputy for EcoMoco, a student advocacy group focused on saving the natural environment in and around Montgomery County. I would like to testify in favor of this bill. I'm concerned about light pollution that may be caused by street and highway lights. And excessive light pollution can be harmful to animals in surrounding areas. Circadian rhythms, which regulate animals' night and day activities, can be confused or disrupted by an excess of nighttime light. A key part of the circadian cycle is melatonin production when natural light levels fade. For animals around the streets and highways, light levels never fade due to the bright street lights. I have seen how streetlights on both local streets and highways around my home illuminate not only the roads but the forests around them. Exposure to this artificial nighttime light can confuse animals' circadian rhythms. Due to a lack of darkness, melatonin production can be disrupted. A decrease in melatonin can lead to stress, fatigue, anxiety, and in some cases, a higher risk of cancer for both animals and humans. Light pollution is easily preventable. This bill can play a significant role in protecting the environment. The animals surrounding the streets should be considered when redesigning outdoor lighting. The design of street lamps must be improved to limit light only to necessary areas. By installing hoods and motion sensors on street lights, lights can be directed only to illuminate streets, allowing the surrounding environment to stay dark. Both humans and animals benefit from a decrease in excessive nighttime light. I support the bill in developing environmentally friendly outdoor lighting standards and encourage the committee to favorably report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any questions for the sponsor, Senator Smith, or any of the panelists? Okay, seeing none, that concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 405. And we will proceed to Senator Augustine. We're going to take you up next. And we're going to be talking about Senate Bill 686. And Senator, we've got two in-person sponsored panelists. I've got William Corsilius and Kitty McElroy. If they're here, they can join you at the table. And then we do have some additional virtual witnesses after that. Signed up favorable amendments. So Senator Augustine, again, we're on Senate Bill 686.
Thank you, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, members of the committee. Senator Malcolm Augustine here on behalf of Senate Bill 686, Environment, Covered Electronic Devices, Recycling Programs Establishment. Colleagues, this piece of legislation seeks to streamline and enhance electronic device recycling efforts in our state by restructuring existing programs and establishing a designated fund to support and optimize electronic waste recycling initiatives. Now, this is not new. This area of recycling of electronics is not new in our state. In 2005, Maryland implemented an electronics recycling law aimed at holding manufacturers accountable for the disposal of their electronic products. Problem is, it didn't work. It just didn't, and it hasn't worked. Our recycling rates are just not unacceptably low, and we know that we have to do better with these electronics, particularly given some of the carcinogens and some of the hazardous materials that are involved in this. So this is the reason why we must do better with this, and we know, as we have in other areas, that we're trying our very best to have a far more circular economy for the things that we do. So what this bill does in order to do that is eliminate the underutilized manufacturer take-back program, and it instead mandates higher already established manufacturer registration fees to fund the Department of the Environment to administer the program. It additionally does authorize a modest consumer fee that may be imposed at the point of purchase for new covered devices. The fee will serve as a fully fund the electronic recyclers and to reimburse the local governments for the staff, equipment, and expenses incurred in addressing the rise in the solid waste that's associated with recycling this type of materials, including the lithium-ion batteries, which we know are quite dangerous. You will find in the presentation that there are a couple of sponsor amendments that are in your packet as well. The first sponsor amendment addresses a consideration that came in your information from MACO. The language on page 9 instead will go back and remain unchanged, which will allow for counties to maintain the independent electronic recycling programs as they currently have. You'll see that they've asked for that, and we're putting that back in. And utilize the recorded recycle weights of the mandatory annual reports under the Maryland Recycling Act. So we're putting that back in for them. We've also put back in MDE because they requested that the consumer fee be collected by the comptroller, which of course just makes sense. So we're fixing that to take care of that. And we also have an amendment as well that removes the specifics of the fees and instead moves it into regulation that would allow for MDE to figure out exactly what the right amount is in conjunction with the advisory council.
to just really determine what the appropriate fees to cover, just to cover costs of the collection and recycling for the program associated with the covered electronic devices. The bill also establishes this advisory council that I just mentioned, which will be able to evaluate and advise on the program's effectiveness. And we also put in the bill that it would allow for MDE to set a baseline of certification for existing recyclers, so that we can just make sure that we know what we're doing with these hazardous materials. I mean, remember, we're talking about mercury, we're talking about lead, flame retardant chemicals, things that we know we have to do a much better job of keeping out of our landfills, which go into our water supply, all kinds of reasons that we know are very important for us to move this piece of legislation forward. With that, I will turn it over to the members of this committee, and I will ask for a favorable report on Senate Bill 686 as amended. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we take the two witnesses and tell us who you are, and you're going to be on the 2-minute clock.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, EEE Committee. I'm Kitty McElroy, here as president of Maryland Recycling Network to support SB 686, following testimony I gave to the U.S. Senate this past July on this exact issue. I also bring my experience managing electronics recycling contracts over the last 10 years at the Northeast Maryland Waste Disposal Authority. I'm not speaking on behalf of the authority. Maryland Recycling Network members include municipal recycling managers, private sector, and nonprofit recyclers and citizens. We thank Senator Augustine for sponsoring this bill. Maryland's e-cycling plummeted in the market downturn of 2014 and has not recovered. We were recycling over 19 million residential pounds per year, now under 8 million pounds. Local government contracts saw costs, and many began landfilling televisions and computer monitors, the bulk of e-waste. Only 8 of 23 counties recycle all electronics year-round without resident drop-off fees. Just 6 Maryland jurisdictions have spent over $8 million since 2014 to run these programs. This is unsustainable. This bill will take that financial burden off local government, grow local jobs, and increase our domestic supply of rare earth minerals and precious metals for the auto, jewelry, and electronics industries. It will allow jurisdictions to divert much needed tax revenues to other critical public sector services, eliminate fees at public collection sites, and expand programs, especially for rural areas. Maryland already has a consumer fee for tire recycling. This bill complements that law to ensure difficult material is responsibly managed. Maryland has already proven itself to be a leader by passing the 3rd e-waste law in the country back in 2005. We are asking you to lead once again and finish building on what is already in place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sir.
Good afternoon. William Creselius here on behalf of Baltimore City Department of Public Works, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan. Thank you very much for allowing me the time and express our position of support for Senate Bill 686. Senate Bill 686 would establish the covered electronic device recycling program in the Department of the Environment. We understand the importance and necessity of recycling program to handle the very large electronic supply, particularly in the city. In 2022 alone, Baltimore City had over 525,000 pounds of electronics recycled. This legislation would obviously ease the financial burdens of localities by implementing modest fees the senator discussed on newly purchased electronics. This legislation would establish fees for covered devices as read in the legislation from Tier 1 to Tier 2. Finally, this program would allow localities to divert more resources to other much needed programs in their respective jurisdiction. And just under a decade, Baltimore City has spent over $900,000 on the type of electronics that have been mentioned prior. With more and more electronics entering the market, it is paramount to have a coherent, sustainable financial plan to deal with electronic recycling, and we firmly believe Senate Bill 686 would provide that framework and sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take some questions now for the folks at the panel, and then we'll pick up the virtual witnesses after that. Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going through the bill, Senator Augustine, as well as some of the witness testimony. So Less Plastics, Please, is a great name of an organization. I love that. Question for you, Senator.
Yep.
January 1 of 2028 is when the program would start, when consumers would pay a fee in purchasing equipment. Is that level of delay? Because that seems like a really long time when we all know that there's a problem now. Is that the most expedient it could be done? Is that the quickest? Ms. McElroy?
Yeah, she is the
She's the
real
expert.
subject matter expert on this
Cool.
for sure.
I have another question as well.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so good question. Obviously, I think we all want to address this problem sooner rather than later. That specific feedback did come from talking with Maryland Department of the Environment. We know that they have a lot of legislative mandates in terms of study bills on top of their existing regulatory responsibilities. So the fact that they told us they were not sure they could meet original deadlines that we had put in the bill, that's why we amended it. Again, I think they're open to discussing timelines. I don't think that has to be a rigid. Yeah, so.
Okay. So Ms. McElroy, I don't know if this is a question for you or the senator or William. What are we talking about? I'm going to the store, I'm going to buy a new laptop. What am I going to pay? Since that is surely going to come up in debate.
Absolutely. Can I answer this? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the range that we have seen over the past 10 years has certainly fluctuated. So this bill, we got this idea, the sponsors included, from California. They have a consumer fee. They're the only other state that utilizes a consumer fee for electronics recycling. It functions very well. Actually, you'll see written testimony was submitted on behalf of the California Product Stewardship Council, providing detail on that specifically, and in support of what we're trying to do. So to answer your question,
yes.
The original range, we had put in $10 for like a large tier 1, like a TV or a computer monitor. Those we know are the most expensive electronics to recycle. And they will be probably for the indefinite future. Tier 2 is going to apply to smaller electronics like cell phones, et cetera. And that's a $5 fee. We're taking out those specific fees because I think it makes sense with what the sponsors are saying to have the advisory council provide feedback and MDE do surveys on costs that current jurisdictions are paying to recycle before we just go ahead and set a fee. Although I do think that the range that was put in there initially is somewhere around what you would see in reality. It might actually be a little bit less, but some of it was to anticipate needing a reserve fund in the beginning. And similar to what California does, there's room here for MDE to adjust the fees as the market changes.
So there's some of this that's a little reminiscent of the pink bill, sponsored by Senator Brooks, that cause a lot of questions, but it just passed the Senate today, and it's the right thing to do. So I am not kidding. I probably have 4 old laptops and 3 old cell phones at home, and I don't know what to do with them, and I want to donate them to a nonprofit, or I want to swipe them clean and all that. I suspect I'm not alone in that. And we just don't know what to do with our electronic devices. I don't want them going into a landfill. Certainly there's a student who can't afford one or a senior who would appreciate one. It's too late to charge me the fee because it's ancient. So what's the impact and anything from what should we be doing? We might as well do public education here. And after January 1, 2028, if this bill moves forward and if that's the date, what consequences and what would the process be for those of us who have stuff that we already own that's in our possession?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I might as well answer this the way I see it working out. So I actually know your program for Montgomery County very well. I actually manage it, have done the procurements for it over the past 10 years. So there is an existing contract. You can bring your material to.
Yes.
The recycler will either refurbish that material if it's usable and has a market, if it's not 20 years old and you didn't pull it out of, somebody's basement.
Right.
It probably still has value, but if not, unfortunately, a lot of municipal electronics don't have a lot of value because they're decades old. So it's at that point, then it becomes you're breaking down that material into different commodities and then selling them. So within certifications that recyclers have to meet, they have to send those to certified downstreams to process. So generally, I think it's the range is like no more than 5%. I'll say that conservatively, where the material that's being broken down from your electronic is going to end up in the disposal stream. The rest of it can find markets. So the plastics, the metals, even leaded glass has markets.
So just to reiterate that, so my old laptop that's not prehistoric, but is reasonable but old, 95% of it can be used in some other way, sold, used, donated, something, and only 5% ends up in the landfill.
If it can be refurbished, then fully reused.
Sure.
But yeah, if there isn't a market, if for some reason they find, software error or something.
Right.
But Senator, I think that's the whole point of the
Yeah.
bill, right? Which is that otherwise it is 100% going into the landfill today.
100%, right.
Instead of us being able to get that much of it back. I mean, a whole 95%. That's the point of the bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Senator Hester.
Thank you. So let me start by saying I'm all for electronics recycling. My question is about how we do it. So last year, the year before, we passed the extended producer responsibility bill. I actually worked in the year 2000 on EPR for electronics in Europe. Why aren't we doing that here now? Have you looked at the model, the EPR model versus this model and asked yourself what is better in the long run? Because my understanding of EPR is that actually with bigger items, electronics, white goods and stuff, it makes more, it's easier, right? It's easier to collect them because there's more, they're bigger and there's less of them. So have we actually done that analysis of this model versus a more standard EPR model?
We can both answer that. You can go first.
You want me to go first?
Sure. And then I do have an answer.
Yeah. So typically, and I'm assuming that this is what your point was. Typically, I believe in Europe, the EPR models that they have is manufacturer responsibility, like full manufacturer responsibility, where they're funding programs. That's noble and that's great. When Maryland Recycling Network started studying this, I mean, personally, I've been researching this for the past 10 years because I manage these contracts and it's been expensive for the local governments that are paying for them. But Maryland Recycling Network specifically started a work group and analyzed different models. What we've seen from other states and other states trying to revamp their laws over the past decade is manufacturers are, first of all, coming in and stopping the process. And second of all, they're saying outright that they're just going to pass the cost on to the consumer anyway. So it's either essentially an invisible recycling fee that's already built into the product that you're buying that they're having to pay for up front, or it's a visible consumer fee that a consumer is paying on that you see on the receipt when you're buying a product.
And I have another answer for that too. So, and I appreciate what you're talking about. I would say that not every solution works for every situation. So last year when we did with the packaging, a significant reason for doing the producer responsibility was because the producers had the opportunity to make certain choices, real choices where they could have significant impact in the recyclability of the particular item versus this, where it's a complete item that we're talking about. This is actually the items themselves, which is it's a little bit different. I would also say that because we're giving flexibility to the MDE on a portion of this, it will in some ways have some amount of a producer responsibility that's a part of that. When we look at since we're moving away from being specific about what the consumer portion of it would be, because it will incorporate some of the other parts of the cost for the recycling of a particular item.
You get us the research that you said. If you spend a decade, I mean,
she has.
That's awesome. I'd really love to read it. I mean, probably not everybody, but I would. Thank you.
It's a lot. Yeah, I will absolutely get it to you.
Okay, any additional questions for Senator Augustine or the two witnesses? Okay, thank you. Thank you, folks, for coming in. Let's move to the virtual witnesses. We've got Dan, let's start with you, Mr. Maddock, Dan Maddock, and then we'll go Kristen, you'll be next. Martha Ainsworth next. Okay, Mr. Maddock, why don't you lead off? You've got 2 minutes and you've signed up straight favorable.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks to the committee for having me. My name is Dan Maddock and I'm here as the Executive Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Securus to testify in support of SB 686. Securus is a Mid-Atlantic based electronics recycling and data destruction company. that has served municipalities, state and federal agencies, and private enterprises for their electronics recycling needs for over 23 years. Our services ensure that the electronic waste does not end up in landfills and jeopardize the environment for both current and future generations. To carry out our mission of securely repurposing electronics with excellence, it is critical that we cover the costs that we incur during our operations. These costs come in the form of employee salaries and benefits, facilities leasing, recycling machinery, maintenance, and logistics costs to cover the transportation of equipment from client sites to our processing facilities. While we would love to be able to cover our operating costs from the proceeds we generate from the recycled commodities we produce, this is often not economically feasible. The cost to recycle e-waste is often more than the residual value of the equipment itself, and we cover this gap by charging upfront recycling fees to our clients. While working in Maryland and with other organizations around the country, we have seen both programs that are well-funded and those that are not. Unfortunately, the well-funded programs tend to work smoothly and efficiently, providing a valuable service for residents and tangible employment opportunities for diligent workforces. In contrast, poorly funded programs tend to get shut down and leave residents scrambling to find ways to get rid of their old electronics in a way that protects the environment. To handle electronics recycling the right way, we are strong advocates for well-funded programs that encourage recycling vendors and residents to handle end-of-life equipment properly, like the proposed covered electronic device recycling program outlined in this bill. We strongly support the passing of SB 686 and are happy to answer any questions or provide additional information as requested. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Maddock? Okay, seeing none. Next witness is Martha Ainsworth. Ms. Ainsworth, again, you're on the 2-minute clock. And again, you signed up actually favorable with amendments. So you have to describe what those amendments may be. So you're up.
Correct. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and committee members. I'm Martha Ainsworth, Chair of the Maryland Sierra Club Zero Waste Team, speaking in support of SB 686 on behalf of the chapter's 70,000 members and supporters. Maryland's had this electronics program since 2005, but the program's funding, based entirely on manufacturers' registration fees, has been inadequate to reimburse local governments for the cost of collection and recycling. In the past decade, residential electronics recycling has dropped precipitously, and many programs have dropped collection of the most expensive devices to recycle, the TVs and computer monitors. Whoops. Furthermore, access of the public to recycling drop-off points has remained low. Of the 8 counties that provide year-round collection of all electronic devices, 3 have only a single drop-off site. 7 counties have no public drop-off point at all. So the Sierra Club supports the bill's intent to increase funding for electronics recycling, but it must ensure that the new financing mechanisms will be adequate. It also is an opportunity to improve program performance. So we encourage the committee to consider the following amendments, and at least one of them has already been mentioned, and we support it. Set the registration fee annually at a level to fully fund the department's anticipated costs while reflecting the market share of each manufacturer's product and recyclability of their devices. We support the amendment mentioned by Senator Augustine to replace the $5 or $10 recycling fee with a fee for each covered device category that MDE might determine that reflects the actual cost of collection and recycling. Include an evaluation of the convenience and availability of drop-off sites in Maryland with recommendations and estimated costs for improved access. And finally, echoing Senator Kagan's point, to avoid another 5 years of insufficient funding, move up the start date of funding flow by 2 years to 2027. With these strengthening amendments, we request a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Ainsworth? Okay, seeing none, and one other virtual witness is not in the queue. So that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 686. Thank you for your testimony. We're going to next go to Senator Lewis Young, Senate Bill 726. Okay, Senator, again, we're on Senate Bill 726, and why don't you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Vice Chair and members of my committee. This bill.
Yeah, can we, where was she, son? I'm sorry. We may have missed one witness in the prior panel, but let me just. Okay, I apologize. You know what? Can you just go right to the front row? We have one witness that I missed on the unfavorable in the prior panel. Okay, is she in the house here? Okay, let's get Sarah Lewis, yeah, just go right there. I do want to before we move on, I want to make sure we didn't skip a witness, which we did do with one witness, Pam Casemeyer. Let's wait 10-15 seconds. There you are. My apologies. My apologies. Okay, well, you're here. We're back on the prior bill, 686, one witness, and then we'll go right back to Senator Lewis Young. Okay, there you go.
And no problem. Hi, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Pam Casemeyer here on behalf of the National Waste and Recycling Association. Respectfully, in support of this bill, I guess we would say support with amendment. We are not weighing in on the very specific details. I know they already have some amendments. Actually, the National Waste and Recycling Association has not historically weighed in on specific product issues. It's not at the table on paint. It's not on the table on mattresses. I'm here at the table really to say this electronics issue really needs to be looked at. It is an issue that really does affect the recycling facilities themselves. It reflects so many opportunities that we're missing and deficiencies in our current program. So we're really here just unusually on a specific item to say we hope that the state will focus on figuring out how to enhance our program, not on any specific details that are in the bill.
Okay, just to correct the record, yes, you signed up favorable with amendments. I misspoke there. Any questions
okay.
for Ms. Casemeyer? Okay, yes. Okay, no, that's okay. Okay, we actually, one other virtual witness, I apologize, was not in the queue, but apparently she had a bad link. So let's try to get her on here, and then we're gonna go. I promise after this, we're gonna go to you guys. And in fact, since she's virtual, you guys can at least come up and sit at the table here because you're going to be right after that. So. Okay, I think we're just going to have to move on at this point. Technical problem. In any event, I think the issue was framed properly by the other witnesses. So, okay, God, this is like okay, never mind that too. Okay, Miss Oldendorf, hopefully you're in the queue here. Do you hear us? Okay, there you are. Okay, and you have signed up favorable back on Senate Bill 686, and you're on the 2-minute clock. And why don't you start?
Okay, thank you for coming back for me. Hello, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, members of the committee. My name is Kristen Oldendorf. I'm Director of the Public Policy for the Solid Waste Association of North America, known as SWANA, which I'm representing today. Personally, I'm a resident of Baltimore City. I previously worked for the city of Baltimore for over 10 years, including as chief of waste diversion, where I managed the city's recycling contracts, including electronics recycling. I am not representing Baltimore City today. I just wanted to note that background. SWANA's headquarters are in Silver Spring, Maryland, and our 10,000 members are spread out throughout North America. Our members include the individuals who are managing the electronic drop-off programs and centers, transporting materials, managing recycling facilities and landfills, conducting residential outreach, and much more. Among the many benefits this bill would result in, which have been discussed, safety is a very important one for SWANA. Fires caused by lithium-ion batteries are increasingly common in solid waste and recycling facilities and collection vehicles, creating a major safety risk. Batteries embedded in electronic devices can create fires when the device is crushed by collection and compacting equipment or dropped on scraped and hard surfaces, among other causes. This bill would provide additional options for consumers to properly recycle electronics and would provide funding for collection sites to purchase heat spot and fire detection and suppression equipment, helping to reduce the risk and danger of fires. It is important as well to keep electronics out of landfills and waste energy facilities in order to recover and recycle the valuable materials within them, and so that we can keep harmful chemicals out of these facilities. The EPA currently has proposed regulations open for comment that would set even stricter emission limits on landfills and incinerators. For example, EPA's proposed regulations on large municipal waste combustors would limit emission of air pollutants, including lead, mercury, and cadmium, which are commonly found in electronics. SB 686 would support the ability to divert electronics for recycling. My submitted written testimony provides additional points and information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Oldendorf? Okay, seeing now that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 686, and we're going to go now back to Senate Bill 726. Senator Lewis Young, and we'll take Senator Elfreth. You'll be next after this particular bill. And you've got a panel. Why don't you lead off, and then we'll go down the panel and just take it that way. Okay, so you take the time you need to present Senate Bill 726.
Thank you. Since I've already presented my afternoon greetings, I'll jump right in. This bill amends the Bay Restoration Fund, which I will refer to as BRF. It's a statute that helps us better understand why we need to take corrective action. This amendment, well, it's not an amendment, it's a clarification, and it better meets the spirit and intent of the statute. We believe the statute was developed to better incentivize municipal utilities to affordably upgrade their facilities to enhance nutrient removal, which I will refer to as ENR, and mitigate the threats of legacy infrastructure to public health and our environment. The Middletown experience, which you will hear about, is a case study on why we believe this statute needs further clarification. They were recently notified by MDE, the Department of Environment, that one of their wastewater treatment plants, an aerated sewage lagoon, will not comply with the climate change resiliency requirements for their next 5-year permit, which will begin in 2026. The lagoon is located in a 100-year floodplain and must be decommissioned rather than replaced, according to the preference of the town leaders. As a result, the town's second wastewater treatment plant will need a complete renovation and capacity expansion in order to treat all the town's wastewater. The estimated project cost is $40 million. Now, to be clear, there are alternative options, none of which are really good. So one option is to upgrade the existing plant. It is unique. As I mentioned, it is a lagoon in a 100-year floodplain. We all know 100 years are turning into 10 or 5 years. Upgrading that plant would be extremely expensive and environmentally risky. And we all like to do long-term planning rather than short-term fixes. Second option is build a totally new facility in the existing floodplain. That also wouldn't be either fiscally or environmentally responsible. So the option that the town leaders has selected is to decommission the current facility, install a pump station, and build the infrastructure to pipe the wastewater across town to the second facility with increased capacity to the second facility and equip the new facility with ENR. As I mentioned, very expensive price tag. For such an expensive and comprehensive project, the BRF subsidy and the ENR upgrade seem to be the town's best and only option. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, total price tag of $40 million, 10 of which would be the town's responsibility. Like many rural communities or small towns, Middletown owns and operates their water and sewer facilities as an enterprise fund, a $10 million project that will overhaul the entire wastewater treatment process and infrastructure isn't spurred by growth and development, which clearly would provide some additional funding, but by a state permitting requirement. So this will ensure the town this kind of investment responsibility on the part of the town would almost guarantee that it can't do another capital project for about 30 years. If you look at the debt to asset ratio, the town only has assets of about $25 million. So a debt of $10 million, I believe, would really jeopardize their bond rating as well, drive up their borrowing costs, and we all know the consequences of that. So we've had numerous conversations in writing and in person over the last couple of months with the Maryland Department of Environment, but it was really obvious that there's a disconnect between the intent and purpose of the BRF and MD's BRF funding eligibility criteria. So that's why we are putting in this bill to better support what we believe is truly the intent and, of course, address the exorbitant project costs, but installation of ENR level wastewater treatment facilities and the sensible removal of legacy infrastructure that possesses significant risk to our public health and the environment should be the top priorities of the Bay Restoration Fund. And we do believe that MDE should provide the support and discretionary funding needed to meet the goals of the state. And that is the background for this bill. So in conclusion, removing treatment infrastructure from a flood zone, and if I haven't said it already, I'll say it again, this is really a unique situation. I believe it is the only wastewater treatment lagoon facility in a floodplain in the state. So it would reduce this pollution and preempt likely environmental public health catastrophes. And so we believe that it's very necessary to clarify the existing law in order to provide 100% funding. The BRF should incentivize our municipal utilities to upgrade their facilities and participate in our goals for the environment. It shouldn't harness our communities with debt and prevent them from becoming the environmentally proactive municipal governments that we're trying to encourage and they truly want to be. So I appreciate your support in addressing this unique and challenging situation.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Why don't we just we'll go down the table. Sir, why don't you get the mic in front of the senator, and each of you are going to be on the 2-minute clock. So first of all, tell us who you are.
All right, I'm John Miller. I'm the Burgess or Mayor of Middletown. And I did want to speak today. Thank you for having us, and Senator Feldman. Appreciate your attention to the matter. Middletown is facing, as the senator mentioned, a $40 million mandate from MDE. It's not for anything that we have caused. It's not because of poor planning. It's not because of growth. It's because of a mandate to get to the ENR levels. And this is what has caused us to face this financial crisis, if you will, in the town of Middletown. This was initiated by MDE, and we think that through the BRF, there is a responsibility there to pay for this 100% as is indicated in the statute. The lagoon is a hot topic in the state. MDE will not permit a lagoon for wastewater treatment any longer. Ours will be no longer permitted as of 26. So therefore, all of that treated sewage needs to go to the other plant, which again is through a tremendous financial obligation to be upgraded and renovated to handle all of the sludge and the sewage coming that way. As a result, Middletown cannot handle all of that debt that's going to be required of us to decommission this lagoon. And when you decommission the lagoon, what that means is all of the treatment that goes on in that lagoon now has to take place in the east plant. So all of that process of decommissioning the lagoon and sending that sewage to the east plant is all part of the ENR process, and therefore should be covered by MDE 100%. I think the senator did an excellent job of covering all the points that we're very interested in covering in Senate Bill 726, and we certainly ask for a favorable report from the committee.
Okay, thank you. Let's go down the table. Very good.
Good afternoon. My name's Jennifer Falcinelli, and I'm one of the town commissioners and Burgess Pro Tem. Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and committee members. I have served as a town commissioner for 28 years and as chair of the Middletown's Water and Sewer Committee for over 20 years. Middletown is a small town with only 5,000 residents and 1,700 water and sewer accounts. It is a constant challenge to fund needed infrastructure improvements with such a small customer base. In 2000, we funded, without grants, a $4 million state-of-the-art East wastewater treatment plant. 20 years later, in 2020, our residents paid off this debt. Now we are facing a $40 million ENR upgrade with at least $10 million unfunded. This would almost triple our debt per customer. Our residents cannot afford this, and we have a fiducial responsibility to our residents who just paid for a wastewater treatment plant. Middletown currently has $5.2 million in long-term debt due to a new reservoir and water main replacements. We invest in our infrastructure, take pride in our town, and are proactive. We do not believe entering into a consent order is proper planning. We also have other critical infrastructure needs that need to be funded in the future. The town of Middletown and our residents cannot afford $10 million in long-term debt. The Burgess and commissioners are asking for your help and support. Middletown has unique challenges in this ENR upgrade, and the increased subsidy in Senate Bill 726 will help defray some of the costs. Decommissioning our lagoon in a floodplain and pumping the wastewater to the east plant is an integral part of achieving ENR in the town of Middletown. Removing infrastructure from a floodplain to prevent future catastrophes is 100% necessary, is 100% logical that the Bay Restoration Fund pay 100% of these costs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sir, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair Feldman and committee members for hearing us today. My name is Paul Mantello. I'm the town administrator from Middletown. And I'm going to speak briefly today about the technical aspects and the history of the Middletown wastewater treatment ENR upgrade. And first, I think it's important to clarify how and when the town was notified that we'd be mandated to complete such an expensive project, and then also talk a little bit about MDE's Bay Restoration Fee eligibility criteria and those implications and the implications for Middletown. MDE's Surface Discharge Division oversees our discharge permits. And on two previous occasions, they informally indicated to town staff that our lagoons permit will likely not be renewed in future permit cycles. At their recommendation, we applied for BRF funding to draft a preliminary engineering report, which is about 90% complete. This is all without official guidance and direction from MDE. As you can imagine, we were very surprised and concerned by the preliminary report's high cost, the very expansive scope, and the devastating impacts that $10 million of unanticipated long-term debt would have on the town. So to confirm the need for a $40 million overhaul, we reached out to the Surface Discharge Department to request a formal notice explaining that a treatment process upgrade is necessary to comply with the next permit cycle in 2026. They returned a letter, which was included in our testimony submittals, explaining the lagoon will not meet the ammonia limits and resiliency requirements of the next permit, and advised clearly that a treatment process upgrade is needed. Unfortunately, we now know the cost of compliance with our next permit cycle is $40 million. And that also the MDE's Bay Restoration Fund eligibility criteria guidelines are clear. The technology and infrastructure that are directly produces ENR treatment are funded at 100%, but the supporting infrastructure needed to convey the wastewater to the ENR plant or process sludge and other byproducts are only partially funded. I would strongly encourage the committee to look favorably on Senate Bill 726.
Okay, thank you. Let's go next to one of our former colleagues, former Senator Mano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Chair Feldman, Senator Lewis Young, thank you so much for your consideration and for your attention to this matter. We also would like to thank Secretary McElwain, Les Knapp, Jeff Fretwell, and members of the governor's executive staff for their attention to this very unique situation. Senators, this is a really important issue. I would pray that it doesn't happen in any of your districts, but of course it won't. And the reason for that is this situation is an anomaly in the state of Maryland. The town of Middletown operates a open air wastewater treatment lagoon that was mandated by MDE to erect back in the 1970s. They've operated that facility without incident for 48 years and is now being mandated by MDE to close the facility. And that's really the shorthand of what they're being told. Of course, as was mentioned before, the cost of doing so is enormous. The cost of doing so in this particular case, an open air wastewater treatment lagoon in a floodplain, 100-year floodplain, is much more expensive. It's much more technically challenging, and it brings with it, I think, a scenario that was not fully envisioned when the BRF was written. Of course, the BRF has two provisions that seem to apply to the situation, but neither are perfectly applicable. The first is that a wastewater treatment lagoon will be reimbursed at the rate of 50%. And the other is that a project that is a threat to public health and water quality is reimbursed at 100%. Well, the town is vexed to think of any other example of a greater threat to public health and water quality than a 9 million gallon open air sewerage lagoon in a floodplain, which is a threat to the town and to the three waterways that are sandwiched around this facility. For those reasons, Senator Feldman, we think this is an anomaly and we'd ask for a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is Sarah Price here? Okay, why don't you've also signed up and you're the only additional favorable witness. So Senator Mano, if you could give her the mic and then we could take Q&A after that. Okay, tell us who you are.
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Price, and I'm here today testifying on behalf of the Frederick County Executive Jessica Fitzwater in support of Senate Bill 726. As you have heard others testify, this bill authorizes the Bay Restoration Fund to include costs related to decommissioning wastewater treatment lagoons. This is particularly important to the county as the town of Middletown currently operates their wastewater facility and lagoon, and due to MDE regulations will be required to decommission this facility. Frederick County government strongly supports this change to help ensure that local governments have the support that they need to decommission wastewater treatment lagoons and move forward with more modern wastewater treatment facilities. Therefore, the Frederick County Executive is requesting a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the panel. Questions from the committee? Senator Carozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the sponsor. And I'm not sure if this would go to the sponsor or to Senator Mano, but as this came up, I'm of course looking at my 3 counties, trying to figure out, how this might affect them. And in the course of trying to pick up more information, I've just received information from the Environmental Directors Conference that they sent in a support with an amendment that would include, I guess, to add and bermed infiltration ponds. So I wanted to bring that to your attention because I was trying to touch base with the environmental directors in my counties and municipalities. And I guess going back to, I'm trying to figure out how this legislation, it looks like it's obviously trying to fix a certain problem, but how it might be affecting other wastewater treatments, municipal wastewater treatments in the rest of our districts.
I mean, the correction, the statute correction that we have offered is very narrow in scope. It's very strategic, very targeted. We think this is a very unique situation. We don't see any other example. My concern about the favorable with amendment testimony that you are citing is that'll open up the floodgates, pun intended. I suppose there are all kinds of situations that might request an exception, but after serious, extensive conversations with MDE, we truly believe that A, this is unique, and B, this request is totally within the spirit of the statute. I hope that answers your question.
2000.
Correct.
6 or 4. Okay. Did you want to comment further, Senator?
Thank you, Senator Carozza. I'm not sure what more I can add. It's truly an anomaly. There's nothing else like it in the state of Maryland. We believe, and it's debatable, that the Bay Restoration Fund speaks to this issue specifically. And that being the very precise language in the statute that talks about public health threats to public health and water clarity. Again, the town operates a 9 million gallon open air storage lagoon in a 100-year floodplain, which according to FEMA floods every 30 years. They've operated it for 48 years without incident. There's going to be a problem. And moving that per the mandate by MDE is extremely expensive. So we believe that the statute covers it right now, but assuming that that's not the case, a more conservative read of the statute would indicate that it's 50%. That's simply outside the scope of what the town can handle. They've just paid off 20 years debt service on their wastewater plants. That meant that projects from public health and traffic projects have been put in the back burner for 20 years. They've just got out from under the debt. Now they're beginning to move forward those other projects which have been on the back burner, and now they're being straddled with this unfortunate situation. So that's a long way of saying, Senator, we think that this is the only situation in the state which the Bay Restoration Fund speaks to, and at least in the spirit, as Senator Lewis Young just mentioned. And if that's not entirely clear, it's certainly debatable as to whether that's what the statute says. This bill would codify that this is a unique anomaly, the only of one of its kind. Thank you.
That's where I was going.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any additional questions for the panel or for the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, thank you, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We just have one unfavorable witness from MDE, from the Maryland Department of Environment. We've got Jeremy Baker. Mr. Baker, why don't you come up? You're signed up unfavorable. And that'll be the final witness on this piece of legislation. So Mr. Baker.
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and members of the committee. For the record, Jeremy D. Baker on behalf of the Department of the Environment in opposition to Senate Bill 726. I just want to clarify two things on the top. MDE is not mandating ENR for this project, and we are not mandating the decommissioning of the lagoon. We are in talks with Middletown to explore other options. The Bay Restoration Fund provides grant funding for wastewater treatment plants to upgrade to an enhanced nutrient removal or ENR level of treatment. Current law requires MDE to pay for up to 100% of the eligible costs, which are only the eligible costs related to upgrading these wastewater treatment plants to the ENR standards. To date, the BRF has been used to successfully upgrade 77 wastewater treatment plants around the state. Currently is being used to fund an additional 25 projects. All of these upgrades have followed the existing statutory requirements for the allocation of BRF funds. Through the BRF, we are able on average to fund up to 60% of a project through grant funding. The other 40%, which is equal to on average $5.9 million in project costs, are not covered by the BRF grant. These costs, however, can be covered by other funding, which MDE helps connect an applicant with, including MDE's low interest loans and other funds. Historically, the state does not provide 100% funding for any of these projects, as the state looks to have some level of local government cost share for these capital projects. This legislation would not be consistent with that principle and does not consider the ability of a local jurisdiction to cover the additional costs without grant funding. The existing formula has been used successfully for over 20 years to upgrade wastewater treatment plants in Maryland and is a national leader in this effort. Finally, any additional BRF grants provided for wastewater treatment plant upgrades beyond the current eligibility would decrease the funding available to local governments for other eligible uses of these funds, including stormwater management, overflow abatement, septic connections, and the Clean Water Commerce Program. While MDE is opposed to this legislation, we are committed to working with any entity in securing other funding for infrastructure projects that would help benefit the environment and public health of the state. Accordingly, MDE asks for an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Baker? Yes, Vice Chair Kagan.
Mr. Baker, thank you for your testimony. Just wondering if you and Senator Lewis Young have had conversations. Can we assume that those happened, that you tried to find common ground, tried to find amendments or something to accomplish the goal without some of the concerns that you've expressed?
Yes, Madam Vice Chair, and we're continuing to have conversations with both the senator and the town, the panel that you heard from. And ideally, MDE would like to find a non-legislative solution, and we are continuing to work with the town of Middletown to find other sources of funding other than what this bill would open up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I've been part of some of those meetings with the governor's office, and I really strongly encourage you to continue that dialogue. Okay.
Absolutely.
They're in a bit of a pickle. Okay, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 726. We're next going to go to Senator Elfreth, who's patiently been listening to that prior piece of legislation. So do you have a preference? We've got two bills. You have a preference on which we was first? Okay, let's start with Senate Bill 546 then.
Perfect.
And
If my panel may come up, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Absolutely.
And thank you for your patience. I apologize. I was in voting earlier.
Yes.
Didn't want to miss that.
Absolutely. Don't want you to miss
Okay.
that. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Senator Sarah Elfreth here to present Senate Bill 546 on a topic this committee knows well, living shorelines. And the bill does two main things, and then I'll tell you why it's important. First, it clarifies circumstances under which MDE may issue a waiver for a living shoreline requirement. And secondly, it adds support for conversion of existing hardened shorelines to living shorelines by including it as a permitted use in the Tidal Wetlands Compensation Fund. So I know that you know this, but wetlands are incredibly important. They are the lungs of not just the Chesapeake Bay, but the entire world. And unfortunately, due to many factors, overdevelopment, climate change, et cetera, we are at risk of losing up to 70% of our wetlands over the next century unless we take some drastic actions here. We all know that they are important and practical, proven solutions for buffering floods, purifying water, reducing erosion, storing carbon, and of course, serving as critical wildlife habitats for all the keystone species we love about the Chesapeake Bay. But they also are hugely important during major storms and act as more of a buffer against climate issues and serve as a resilience barrier
more so than hardened shorelines. The Living Shoreline Protection Act that this body passed in 2008 took a great step forward. It stated that living shorelines were the preferred method to reduce erosion. MDE may indicate exceptions where structural is more, so the hardened shoreline is more appropriate than non-structural, so the living shoreline. So that kind of outlined in 2008, the process preferred living shorelines, but exceptions for hardened shorelines when and where appropriate. But there have been a lot of waivers given over the ensuing 2 decades. So what this bill does, it simply clarifies existing law regarding those waivers when MDE can or cannot issue the living shoreline waiver. Basically, it's based solely on the property owner's intent to replace a structural shoreline with another structural shoreline. A property owner can still receive a waiver under certain conditions outlined in existing law. And it states that minor repairs to a hardened shoreline would not be impacted by this bill. Mr. Chair, there is an amendment offered by MDE to further clarify the scope. And we do consider this amendment a friendly amendment. Secondly, to encourage more conversion from hardened shorelines to living shorelines, the bill expands the allowable use of the Tidal Wetlands Compensation Fund, which allows for conversion of existing structural or hardened shorelines to those living shorelines. So just a little bit more financial incentive to do so. But Mr. Chair, this is a small clarifying tweak to the current law, and hopefully will encourage fewer waivers, more living shorelines, more protection for our critical habitats and shoreline. And with that, I ask for a favorable report with MDE's amendment.
Okay, why don't we hear from the 2 witnesses and then we'll open up to any questions. Sir, do you want to go first or either one? There you go.
Sure. Thank you. My name is Doug Myers. I'm the Maryland Senior Scientist, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, urging a favorable report on SB 546. And the senator did an excellent job of telling you what the bill does do. I will add to it one thing it does not do. It does not change the review criteria for individual shoreline waiver requests. As a matter of fact, that would stay the same. And I think that was an early concern. I would like to expand on the idea that decisions about a shoreline's health are very difficult to make at the scale of 100 feet or 200 feet in an individual shoreline, because the processes that maintain those marshes, those beaches, those shorelines occurs over several miles. And so having the authority for the department to take a look at larger chunks of shoreline and not just the proposed bulkhead or living shoreline proposal allows for that extra attention to the scale at which these things actually happen. There's a tool that's called the Shoreline Mapper that allows for MDE to take a look at each of those shorelines in their context of whether or not they would be appropriate for living shorelines or whether they would need a site-by-site appraisal. And so that tool is available both for MDE's use, but also for the landowner and other resource agencies. The last thing I'll say is hard armoring does prevent marshes from migrating. And in the sea level rise scenario that we're in right now, it's really important for us to maintain an intertidal zone. Allison's going to expand on that in a bit as to why that's so important for the critters of the bay. On a single property owner decides to armor their shoreline, the displacement of wave energy to either side kind of requires that others do the same. And so if we take a closer look to the waivers that we're providing to folks that are proposing to armor shorelines, even if they currently have one, it's very important for us to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Allison Colden. I'm the Maryland Executive Director with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'd just like to reiterate and add a couple of points on why reversing the trend of hardening Maryland shorelines is so critically important. You'll see in your testimony some written testimony from Dr. Rochelle Seitz. She is a preeminent scientist focusing on the impacts of hardened shorelines from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Her research has indicated that there are threshold impacts to our bay's health and its communities, not only the living communities, but also its biological communities by hardening. For example, for every 10% increase in shoreline hardening, we see a 4% decrease in blue crabs. So this shoreline hardening is directly impacting the productivity of our bay's fisheries. In addition, Many of the projects which are currently hardened are now reaching the end of their effective life, were most likely built prior to the 2008 Living Shorelines Act being enacted. And therefore, there was never an opportunity for a living shoreline to be considered or a waiver to be evaluated at the time the project was originally installed. Not only that, there are a lot of homeowners who rely exclusively on their contractors and their expertise and may not even know about a living shoreline as an option without the opportunity to go through a waiver process and consider a living shoreline and its appropriateness for their own property. And lastly, I'll just mention that last year there was a very important report released by the Chesapeake Bay program known as the Caesar report. I don't have enough time on the ticker there to go through what it stands for. But basically it reflected on the past 40 years of bay restoration and made recommendations for what we should be doing moving forward. And one of those key recommendations is focusing our near-term restoration on shallow water habitats with multiple benefits for water quality and living organisms. And I cannot think of a better example of that than restoration with the use of living shorelines. So thank you so much for your time, and I urge a favorable report.
Okay, questions for Senator Elfreth or the two panelists, Vice Chair Kagan.
Mr. Chair. Senator Elfreth, you are so smart at this stuff, and you guys work in this and are immersed in it all the time. For those of us on this committee who are not as expert, and certainly for anyone in the audience or watching at home, I just looked up hardened shorelines definition, and I'm just going to read this, and then maybe one of you could just put it into plainer English just so we know exactly what we're talking about. Because obviously the implications is what the bill's about. And so we have to have the definition. So shoreline hardening means features such as seawalls, revetments, which is not a word I know, riprap, not a word I know, and bulkheads that block or significantly inhibit landward movement of the shoreline and are used to protect structures or other features from erosion and other coastal hazards. So other than learning two possible Scrabble words, I wonder if you could put some of this into plainer English and why it's so important and what the issue is, just really basic.
I'd be happy to, Senator.
Thank you,
I've
Doug.
been dealing with these things for several decades now. The four different structural types are all just different shapes and sizes. The effective thing is they are preventing the landward movement of that intertidal zone, the area between wet and dry that is so important for the critters. So what generally happens is if the sea level's rising, I have to do some interpretive dance here, and you have a bulkhead or a revetment or riprap or any other shape along the shoreline that's preventing that landward movement, the waves hit it, they bounce off, and they actually will add amplitude. They'll get stronger over time till the point they start eating away at the sediment underneath the structure. Eventually gravity takes place and pulls the structure down. That's why a homeowner would have to replace it, is because the sea levels rose and the wave energy has destroyed the ability for it to do its thing and hold it in place. So the living shorelines, because of the way they're constructed with the offshore breakwater, that kind of dissipates that wave energy so that whatever wave's actually hitting the shoreline is much smaller. It's settling out a lot of the fine particles that are in suspended in the water so that it lays down at the place where your intertidal zone is, and there's vegetation there that's been planted to be able to take advantage of that. So you maintain an intertidal zone at many different water levels, even after storm events. Whereas if you had the bulkhead or the riprap or the revetment, that's all going to be getting scoured over time. Eventually will fall down and you'll have to replace it. All this bill is saying, if you're going to be at that decision point, let's make the best decision we can about the shoreline. There certainly are cases from the definition you saw that there might be a building right at the top of the bluff, and armoring is the only choice you have because you don't want to lose the building. But in a lot of cases, we have very, very low shorelines with quite a bit of space that would be able to accommodate the movement of water levels over time, and a living shoreline is the best treatment for that.
And to further nerd out, if I may, for a second, and the story of how all things are related and all this is one habitat we're talking about. The oyster reefs that used to exist all throughout the Chesapeake Bay used to absorb that wave energy. And since we completely ravaged those oyster reefs and they no longer exist, there's nothing to absorb that shock anymore. And so that's all part of the challenge here.
Both, appreciate it.
Okay, Senator Simon Air.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I've actually, when I was a kid, helped make some of those in our community, paid some bills, but the scope is public and private, correct?
Mhm.
And some have this notion that if you have waterfront property, you're rich. Well, there's a lot of areas where there were summer cottages handed down and they're old buildings and they're barely making their mortgage. I was reading the fiscal note. It said the department already has the ability to provide the grants from this fund. Do you know how much they're giving out to homeowners who want to do the right thing, but it's too expensive?
Actually, don't have the answer for that.
And we have is it MDE? We have MDE witness next up. Maybe he, Mr. Baker.
Okay.
Jeremy, do you have an
Well,
answer?
actually, Jeremy, you're actually next up. Why don't you even come on up here, even if you don't have an answer to this one, you're going to be the next witness favorable with amendments. I assume it's the friendly amendment Senator Elfreth was referencing, but if you got it, it's good to have you up here in case.
If we don't have it, Senator, we can get you
Yeah.
that information.
That'd be good.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair. Senator, I don't have that information on hand, but I will get that to you and the members of the committee.
Okay, if you could, that'd be helpful. And then also, if somebody wants to fix their property and they find out the cost is too much and they can't get the money from the fee or the fund, is there a waiver giving them for financial hardship, or is it just the environmental impact? And if so, what do they do?
So MDE's waiver process does not include an evaluation of the financial aspects of it. There are in some cases, there can be some additional upfront costs. In other cases, it can actually be as cost effective as a bulkhead or another structural solution that they're looking into. It all depends on a specific site. And also, as Doug mentioned before, these are self-maintaining for the most part over time. So the long-term costs of these projects are typically lower than maintaining a project that you have to completely replace. That is, I believe, our intent and the Senator's intent with making those funds available is to specifically incentivize the retrofitting of the hardened shoreline to the living shoreline. So that's the intent of making those funds available, is for those who have to incur those costs, that they would have the availability of that fund to them to help cover those additional costs.
Okay, last question. As far as the money getting to the constituents, currently they say they can do it. Is there a priority of who gets the money, and is this bill adjusting that priority so they get the money first or higher on the list, if there is a priority list?
Yeah, defer to MDE on that.
I am not sure, Senator. I'll get back to you on that one as
Okay,
well.
that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Apologize.
I think like most of what we do here, the legislation is trying to tell, it's a strong urging to the department of our intent. And so even if they currently can, I think this bill will help them, to your point, prioritize these projects.
We have funds, we actually list the priorities, so they have to do that. So,
okay.
So one, if we can find out if they are currently giving money to people and how much in the last year or two. And then if there is a priority, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Mr. Baker, since you're sitting there, why don't you give us your 2-minute favorable with amendment testimony, and then we'll see if there's some questions for you. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be brief. Vice Chair Kagan, I had never heard the word revetment either, so that was new for me as well. I just want to thank CBF and the Senator for the collaboration and taking our amendments. Basically, we were concerned that as written, there was some operational impact to MDE. It was talking about grant funding, and we would have needed to hire a grant administrator and a support person. So there was a $100,000 component to the fiscal note that we think the changes via amendment will help us to minimize, and to the point where we don't actually need either of those pins, because we get to use the existing programs that are the existing sources of money and programs that are already in place to incentivize these projects. So with that, I'll just ask for a favorable with amendments report.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Baker? Yes, Senator Gallion. And by the way, we do have one additional witness. Maybe I should bring her up. One final witness, Jana Davis from the Chesapeake Bay Trust, who's here just for informational purposes. But why don't you give a question for Mr. Baker, and then we can take Ms. Davis, and that'll be the extent of the testimony.
Mr. Baker, or one of the panelists. So I had a chance to tour some living shoreline work that was done at Havre de Grace recently. I know they had a major challenge getting through red tape to even be able to do it, but once it finally was done, it's really, really well done. So understand the concept. Just roughly, how much more expensive is a living shoreline as compared to one of these? I think you call them a hardened. I mean, is it like twice as expensive usually, or are they pretty comparable in price? Just to kind of give us a ballpark. Doesn't have the exact number, just ballpark.
Yeah, it is a very site specific thing. The Havre de Grace example I'm very familiar with that one because there was so much seagrass directly off the hardened shoreline that was there before. There was a lot of, review that had to happen, a lot of mitigation that had to be discussed. So that kind of inflated the scale of that project. But it's, there are some per linear foot costs that are out there in comparison to different things. So if you have the exact same kind of shoreline and you were either considering armored shoreline or a living shoreline for that, the costs are comparable at that per linear foot cost. So it's really hard to mix the apples and oranges and kumquats and asparagus that are all the different kinds of shorelines out there. But for similar shorelines of the same type, same elevation, same wave energy, those kinds of things, the costs are comparable.
Thank you. And Senator, we have another bill on the permitting process that'll be coming to committee soon.
Okay, actually, Ms. Davis, you're the final witness on the bill, so why don't you give us your testimony? You've signed up for information purposes only, but why don't you testify and we'll take a question and then I think that'll be it.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. I'm Janet Davis, the president of the Chesapeake Bay Trust. Usually I talk to you about license plates, so it's very exciting that I get to talk to you about actual shoreline practices today. I was asked to come and just give a little bit more background on the scientific and technical aspects of living shoreline. So Senator Kagan, maybe can answer more of your questions to follow up on professor over here, his background. And we can also talk a little bit about the costs if that's of interest. So a lot of you know about the Bay Trust. We were created by you all in the 80s as a way to really help communities get projects done that they want to get done, trees, stream restorations, stormwater practices. And a lot of times people communities ask us for living shoreline projects. And to follow up on the definitions that have already been given, a living shoreline is defined as using as many natural habitat elements as possible to protect shorelines from erosion. Instead of this armor and hard shorelines that we've talked about, the bulkheads, the stone walls, et cetera. We know that the shallow water areas of the bay are where most of the critters live, the crabs that many of us eat, sorry to the vegetarians and those who keep kosher and others, but fish, juvenile rockfish, et cetera. They don't really live as much in the main stem, the open waters of the bay. Different species live there. Unfortunately, shoreline areas where all these critters live also tend to erode, and that's where all the hardened shorelines are. About 18% of the entire Chesapeake watershed is armored, which means we're taking habitat away from those critters. And in some areas, it's over 50%. On the flip side, we do know how important erosion is to shoreline property owners, as Senator Simonaire pointed out. And luckily, here in Maryland, in the 1970s, a practice was developed to protect shorelines from erosion in a really habitat-friendly way. So we should be proud of that and take credit for it here in Maryland. The Trust and MDE and DNR had a living shoreline grant program and still do fund living shorelines. We funded 100 of them, over 10 miles of shorelines. There's some pictures in your packet, and I'm happy to talk about the details of some of those. Not appropriate everywhere, but really good in many cases.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Davis? Yes, Senator Simonaire.
Yeah, if I could follow up with Doug or whoever, just so I can get a handle on, because I don't know the answer. I've heard from other people, but it sounded like you said the cost if you took one property and you just evaluate it with living shore versus hardening or some other type, they're the same cost. Is that what you said?
Yeah, on a linear foot basis. So people are kind of, I think, comparing, like I said, apples and maybe asparagus, that I had this many linear feet of shoreline and it cost me this much to do a living shoreline. And then somebody else, well, it only cost me X number of dollars to build a bulkhead. And unless there's really kind of a pairwise comparison of the same types of shorelines, same slopes, same wave energy or fetch, right? Then it's really difficult to compare that. So where studies have done that and they've looked at similar shoreline lengths heights, wave energy exposure, then it's very comparable. And I can't say it's like exactly the same cost, but it's the same amount of materials, the same amount of linear feet that's treated. The same contractors do both kinds of work. Generally, contractors will do what the landowner prefers. And so that's where you get a lot of, I would say, misinformation about what the actual per linear foot costs are for projects.
So one, if you could get me some information, maybe a contact point I could talk to, because I get some constituents to say that's not the case. I'd like to have some facts behind it.
Sure.
That would be helpful. And does that take into any of the costs, like you said, in Hartford or wherever, Havre de Grace? The extra cost to mitigate for the seaweed and all that, is that above and beyond? And I'm just trying to look what the total package is going to cost a constituent, and so I can talk to them intelligently.
Right. So the example for Havre de Grace, there's surveys that have to be done for how extensive those submerged aquatic vegetation beds are, right? That you have to pay another subcontractor to do that. So that gets included in the cost of the project. There are months of negotiations with the resource agencies over whether or not mitigation needs to happen for that. And then the mitigation costs are added to that. That's why I'm saying the more complex the project, the more likely it's going to be translated into a higher per linear foot cost. If it's the same kind of project in two different situations, one is a hard armoring and one is a living shoreline, the costs are very comparable.
If I could add one thing just very briefly to that, Senator, the situation in which this bill tries to address, if in the same situation that Doug just referenced, that there's mitigation that needs to be required right now, if there were a hardened shoreline there that were being replaced with another hardened shoreline, there would be no review. So we could possibly be losing out on mitigation dollars that should be paid to the state for impacts to other habitats, because right now MDE is issuing these waivers like for like automatically, where the construction of another structural stabilization structure, be it another seawall or another bulkhead, may have impacts to those other habitats. But because there is no sort of project by project review of those like for like replacements, we could be missing out on those mitigation dollars, which could be improving the habitats that are impacted.
Okay. Sure.
Sorry.
Okay. Last word.
I wasn't going to say, but I mean, that seems like it put more financial burden on the property owner, because it's going to cost more. It's great from the environmental standpoint. And that's why I asked those first questions, what resources are available. So I appreciate.
Follow-up.
I like both goals. I'm just trying to make sure we get both.
Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions for Senator Elfreth or the panel? Okay, seeing none, that concludes bill hearing
Thank you.
on Senate Bill 546. And Senator Elfreth, you can stay there. I'm going to call up, we're now on Senate Bill 674, and I've got Nicholas Redding here. They're not actually part of a formal panel, but they're all signed up favorable. So let me bring them up. Nicholas Redding, Bruce Bariano, and Jen Iosa, all signed up straight favorable in person. So Senator Elfreth, why don't you lead off on Senate Bill 674? And we do have a couple of virtual witnesses as well. And Dylan, I see you're actually, looks like you're signed up. Okay, you're actually favorable with amendments, so why don't you stay back there?
It is a friendly amendment.
It's a friendly amendment? Okay, but then you can come up. You can be part of this panel.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Sarah Elfreth here to present Senate Bill 674, Abandoned Boats and Maritime Heritage Grant. We're going a little bit further out into the water with this one, another issue that impacts all coastal communities, and that is abandoned boats. I came to this committee a few years back asking for some tweaks to the abandoned boat law. We were able to do that a couple years ago to help broaden the definition of what is an abandoned boat, so that NRP can go out and take those boats and put them safely onto land before they sink and cause all kinds of environmental and navigational hazards across the bay. That was a positive first step. We kind of learned some lessons since then, and I want to thank the Department of Natural Resources and the Secretary for really digging deep and thinking about what we can do better with under new leadership. And so the result of that is Senate Bill 674. So at least once a quarter, I get a call from a constituent about a boat in a creek or other waterway that is listing. And Madam Vice Chair, listing means it's kind of tilting, taken on water, all kinds of sailing terms. So the boat's listing, we call NRP right away. NRP goes out and checks it out. Maybe it's taken on a little water, Natural Resources Police. Maybe the boat's taken on a little water, but they cannot find the owner of the boat, or they reach out to the owner of the boat, but all we have is a physical address. So we have to snail mail the owner of the boat and say, hi, it appears your boat is listing, possibly abandoned. Can you please respond to us? Obviously, that takes a whole lot of time, particularly in 2024. And what ends up inevitably happening, it happened again this summer, that listing boat sinks. Now, this is, again, an environmental hazard, navigational hazard to other folks using the bay. And also, as an appropriator, it costs the state 5 times the amount of money to lift a sunken boat and tow it than it would have cost to just tow it and get it out of harm's way to begin with. So that is the problem that we are seeking to solve here. Our answers are really simple. It's 2024. We need better contact information for these boat owners. So the bill would allow DNR to collect phone and email contact information, including an emergency contact. And that's going to leverage faster outreach when we, in fact, inevitably have these abandoned vessels. Not just an issue in Anne Arundel County, let me say. We have Baltimore County here, big issue in Southern Maryland, Queen Anne's County, you'll hear from. All across the bay, we have this problem. The second answer here is to establish a vessel turn-in program, something other states have, which is a means-tested method for folks who cannot afford. A lot of folks inherit boats from family members, and sometimes the easiest way, if they can't store it on land, is to store it in the water and kind of leave it behind. So a lot of these abandoned boats are the result of folks just not having another home. And so inevitably they become the public's problem. So having a vessel turn-in program is really going to allow for another option for boat owners who have nowhere else to put their boat. And again, going to save the state a whole lot of headache and environmental consequences. Lastly, the bill creates a maritime heritage grant program within the Waterway Improvement Fund, which is where all of this lives in the code. There is another bill from the Department of Natural Resources, Senate Bill 304, that seeks to raise the fees on boats for the first time in probably 20 years. So that fund will have a lot more money. We're just asking for a little bit of that money. We're talking about the fund's going to go up by $8 million. We're just asking for $250,000 of that to go towards maritime heritage preservation. My best example of that is the Thomas Point Lighthouse in my district. It's Maryland's most iconic lighthouse, been there shining a light since I think 1876. That lighthouse runs on a $26,000 operating budget and a whole lot of volunteers. But when one of their iron legs was about to fall into the bay, this General Assembly stepped up and helped support them, but otherwise they had no other means to get state support for general upkeep of that maritime history. Again, that maritime history that led to our thriving boating industry and certainly sustains our thriving boating industry. Recreational fishermen, watermen love the lighthouse, but they're not contributing at all to its standing in the bay. So we're just asking a part of the fees that they pay go to that maritime heritage preservation. Mr. Chair, I think I covered all of it. I'm really passionate about this bill, as you can see.
We can tell.
Okay, and I asked for a favorable report. There's 2 amendments that we consider friendly. DNR is going to have one, and then we just need to clarify that grant fund a little bit. And so Preservation Maryland has another friendly amendment to clarify the use of that fund.
Okay, before we go to the witness, I know Mr. Barriano usually like the podium. You've signed a favorable. Do you want to take to the podium? And then we'll take the.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go on.
Thank you.
2 minutes. Everybody's on the 2-minute clock now.
The record, Bruce Barriano. I'm here on behalf of Queen Anne's County in support of this legislation. Queen Anne's County, and particularly the Kent Island area, has a very ongoing, long-standing problem, as the sponsor of the bill indicated, with abandoned boats that are no longer in use. Some of them are corroding, and the engine oil and the gasoline are polluting the bays or the water, which is not good. Some of them come back and then just take the water out and party on it, and it's a real problem. It's a real problem. There's another bill, different but still addressing the main problem. That's in floating, as I'll use that pun, in the House, House Bill 293 by Delegate Aarons, Greist, and Jacobs. We've been talking with DNR before this hearing. I think the meeting is being set up, but it would be good to. The senator's bill is great. It really is, and I mean it'll be very helpful. There are some pieces potentially in the other bill that maybe could be additional tools that DNR could use to deal with this problem. So we'll explore that. But Queen Anne's County does support the senator's legislation and urge a favorable report.
let's go down to the table and everybody's on 2 minutes. So
Wonderful. Well, it's great to be here today. My name is Nicholas Redding. I'm the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, which is the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. And we're here to ask for the favorable report on SB 674, which among the other outcomes that you heard about with abandoned vessels would also establish a mechanism to fund a maritime history grant program. We're joined in our support by numerous organizations, some of which who have included written testimony, including the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, Maryland Center for History and Culture, Maryland Humanities, the Southern Maryland National Heritage Area, the Annapolis Maritime Museum, and Historic Annapolis. We need this program because despite Maryland's story being intrinsically connected to the water's edge, there's no dedicated funding, as you heard, available to support exhibits, programming, research, or events at the sites, organizations, and agencies tasked with interpreting this story. Numerous recent reports have documented this need and called out for such a fund. It would also support telling our diverse and unique maritime story, one that encompasses everything from indigenous people's use of the Chesapeake to the struggle for freedom of the enslaved on the brackish shores of the Chesapeake and the pathways to freedom many found on the open water. And while the Bay's future health depends on science and environmental efforts, I would suggest that in reality, the future of the Bay depends on people understanding and appreciating and loving this resource. And so this program would expand on critical investments in heritage tourism as well, providing tangible and unique and valuable products for local tourism agencies to promote. And so in summary, the legislation provides for a direct investment in maritime focused organizations. It supports the health of the Bay. It tells the full story of Maryland history and will also support our economic prosperity. And for those reasons, we urge a favorable report.
okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chairman, and members of the committee. My name is Jen Ayosa. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Baltimore County, and I'm here in support of Senate Bill 674. Baltimore County has a police marine unit, and they came to us in the interim to explain that they have been seeing, as the senator mentioned, a pretty appreciable increase in boats that are either being abandoned, becoming derelict, and sometimes sinking along our county's 200 plus miles of waterway. Many of these vessels contain hazardous materials like gasoline or oil, which can become pollutants, or the boats themselves become obstacles, blocking access to channels or docking sites. As the senator mentioned, our marine unit has suggested that sometimes the cost of maintaining a vessel becomes too much, and so that vessel is simply left. And to put a dollar figure on what the senator mentioned, getting rid of a boat shell is about $100 a foot. And so for a large boat, a 30-foot boat, that could be $3,000. Having to dispose of engine oil, fuel, and other hazardous materials, plus the cost of a crane or a barge to physically remove a boat that's an impediment, can be anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 or more per boat. Senate Bill 674 is not going to change derelict owners, but we do believe it's a step in the right direction by improving the information that is available on a boat registration and bringing us into the 21st century with things like cell numbers and email. We believe that we'll have more reliable information to contact boat owners if they are abandoned or become derelict. For this reason, we would appreciate a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, sir. You're fine. You're the last one on this. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair. For the record, Dylan Baylor, representing the Department of Natural Resources, here testifying favorable with amendments on Senate Bill 674. You've heard a lot about what the bill does. I think just to summarize, firstly, the legislation will authorize the Department of Natural Resources, when issuing that certificate of number for boat registrations, to also collect different contact information, including phone numbers and emails, and then at the same time authorize the Natural Resource Police, when investigating an abandoned vessel, to use that information to be able to contact the vessel owner. Secondly, it does create a maritime preservation history program which we are quite excited about because we want to be able to effectively tell the story of the bay and its history. I think Thomas Point Lighthouse is something that we can all be very proud of, and we're excited to be able to work on that. But thirdly, and I think most importantly for the department, is the authorization to create the vessel turn-in program. So as the sponsor mentioned, and as you've heard from Queen Anne's County and Baltimore County, one thing that the department has heard about over the past year is the need to figure out a potential solution for abandoned and derelict vessels. They cause navigational and environmental concerns, and they are just a challenge across the state. And in doing that, we looked across the country. And I think the one thing that we noticed was that there are several states, Florida, for example, that have a vessel turn-in program. And through the authorization to create said program, the hope of the department is that we can actually mitigate these vessels from becoming abandoned and derelict and causing that problem on the front end, and get folks to turn their vessels in before they become the actual problem. Because as you've heard, it becomes incredibly costly once they actually do sink. And I know I only have 10 seconds left. So with that, our amendment just clarifies a little bit about the vessel turn-in program and the priority order that the department needs to look at when accepting vessels for that. And with that, we request a favorable report with the said amendment.
Okay, before we go to the two virtual witnesses, any questions for Senator Elfreth or any of the panelists? And one question, Mr. Bariano referenced a House bill. Are you familiar with that, or do you know anything about that? Just curious.
We do have a cross file of this bill in the House.
Okay.
The bill he's referring to, I haven't yet read, but I'm happy to
Okay.
do that and look where we can.
Okay,
work
fair
together.
enough. Okay, Senator Simoner.
Thank you. And I love the idea, especially in my area. So thank you for putting this bill in. I saw DNR's amendment. I didn't see the other one, but it seems very broad. It's just giving money and it doesn't have anything tied with it.
Yeah, that was drafting error, and we just got it today, and I'm happy to get it to you unofficially, and then for the voting, we'll turn it into you
So
as an
it
official.
brings
amendment.
in the scope a little.
Yes, it
Okay.
frames it out.
Okay, any additional questions for the panel? Vice Chair Kagan?
Good idea. It's obviously a problem, and this is part of a solution that makes total sense. I just wonder what happens. I sell my boat, I give it to my cousin as a gift. I'm not using it anymore. I'm moving out of state. Therefore, all the contact information is inaccurate. And channeling my inner Senator Hester, how is this going to be protected? I don't think of the Department of Natural Resources Police as the cybersecurity experts of the planet. And I just wonder, and then third question is, will it only be used for this purpose? So no marketing, sharing, selling, and all that. I'd love to see some of that language perhaps in there if that's customary.
So first,
Dylan,
you have
Senator.
to renew your license every 2 years, your fee registration. Sorry, registration every 2 years. So hopefully, if it does change hands, the registration and contact information would be updated. We're only talking about phone numbers and emails here, but if you would be comfortable with some protective language, if in DNR.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the senator summarized it. You are required to update it's called a certificate of number. That's what we consider the registration. Every 2 years, you have to renew that. And additionally, if it does transfer, there are methods in place to transfer that contact information. But with regard to cybersecurity or anything like that, I don't know that off the top of my head. And I would gladly follow up on we have licensing and registration centers that operate a lot like the MVA. And I would assume that they're held to the same standard. I'm happy to look more in depth on that, follow up with the committee.
Thank you. If someone has moved, the 2-year registration renewal might not get to them either. So we can talk about it offline.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have our in-house cybersecurity expert in Senator Hester, so that's okay. Any additional questions for the panel? Okay, seeing none, we do have two witnesses both signed up favorable. Let's get them in here before we call this hearing adjourned. Okay, we've got Lucille Walker. Ms. Walker, you're going to start off. You've got 2 minutes, and again, you're signed up straight favorable.
Yes, thank you, Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee. I am Lucille Walker. I am the Executive Director of the newly designated by the U.S. Congress Southern Maryland National Heritage Area. It includes Calvert, Charles, St. Mary's, and Southern Prince George's counties. I'm here in support of SB 674. Southern Maryland is both a Maryland heritage area and a national heritage area with over 1,000 miles of shoreline. We are a peninsula with the bay on one side, the Potomac River on the other, and including the Patuxent and other rivers. And we see great benefit for this funding opportunity to our region. In particular, the use of this fund for maritime heritage and history projects, in addition to the vital needs of the sunken vessels, et cetera, including historic interpretation, programming, events, support of our lighthouses, marine museum, et cetera, in addition to the critical environmental and research support. We are home to the Potomac River Mallows Bay National Marine Sanctuary, the first national sanctuary on a river. And Southern Maryland is also home to two state-recognized tribes, the Piscataway Conoy Tribe and the Piscataway Indian Nation. And we appreciate that this fund will take into consideration engagement with Indigenous peoples and lands, as well as our descendant communities. Our maritime heritage is essential to who we are. And we thank Senator Elfreth and the others for their sponsorship and the protection and support of this heritage. And we urge a favorable report on SB 674.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Walker? Okay, seeing that, which brings us to our final witness on this piece of legislation. Kanifa Gray, I believe I have a little trouble reading name on the board there. Ms. Gray, you've got 2 minutes. Again, you've signed up straight favorable on this piece of legislation.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Kamita Gray. I'm the president of the Brandywine TV Southern Region Neighborhood Coalition, and I'm in favor of this bill. I'm testifying on the personal effect. I've owned a yacht for 20 years plus. I think that this bill brings Maryland into the same realm as the District of Columbia. We have a yearly registration that updates information. I think this will clarify in contacting the owner whether the boat is abandoned or it's not abandoned, because we have to carry insurance that will get sunken vessels. They do sink. And I do like the turn-in program on this. And I thank you very much. And I ask for a favorable report from this committee. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Gray? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 674. We will next move. We have 4 bills left and all 4 are from Senator Hester. So we are going to start. Senator Hester, we good to go with 958? Is that where you want to start? Or do you want to start with the 9? Okay, we're on 958. Senator Hester, we've got Jennifer. Well, actually, you have a designated sponsor panel. So let's call them up. Nicholas Johnson, Jamie DeMarco, Jose Coronado Flores, and Ethan Hunt are your 4 designated. Ethan Hunt are your 4 designated sponsor panelists. And then after that, we do have some additional witnesses signed up, which we'll take then. Okay, so Senator Hester, we're again on Senate Bill 958.
Thank you very much. And members, I know it's been a long day, but we have totally saved the best for last. For the record, Senator Katie Fry Hester here to present Senate Bill 958. Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, members of the committee, thank you for your consideration of Senate Bill 958, responding to emergency needs from extreme weather, the Renew Act. This is an essential piece of legislation that will generate hundreds of millions of dollars a year to forge a cleaner, more robust and resilient future for the state of Maryland. As you know, the production and consumption of fossil fuels and the resulting greenhouse gas emissions pose a serious and immediate threat to the health and safety of Maryland's communities. These fossil fuels and resulting emissions have trapped increased amounts of heat in the atmosphere, resulting in extreme weather events and a warmer climate. Fossil fuel companies have known the dangers associated with their long use before it became common knowledge. In fact, ExxonMobil knew as early as 1977 and spent decades refusing to publicly acknowledge climate change was a reality. As a result of these climate denial campaigns and refusal to take action, Maryland is experiencing the consequences of rising sea levels, warming temperatures, and increased frequency and intensity of storms and flooding. In less than 2 years, Ellicott City experienced 2 catastrophic 1,000-year floods, which you have heard of before, which destroyed dozens of buildings, cars, businesses, and resulted in the deaths of Marylanders from my district. Unfortunately, it has become the responsibility of the Maryland taxpayer to foot the bill for the costs of climate mitigation, adaptation, and recovery measures. Not anymore. It's time to ensure that the polluters pay. We need to ensure a fully financed, equitable, and just construction of climate mitigation and adaptation measures that does not burden the Maryland taxpayer. Senate Bill 958 is the answer to this call. Specifically, the bill requires companies that have emitted more than 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent, between 2000 and 2020 to pay $900 million a year for 10 years into a new climate change adaptation and mitigation fund. 40 companies, none of which are based in Maryland, will be required to pay into this fund. The penalty will cost these companies roughly 1/5 of 1% of their annual profits. And for the record, I provided a list of these companies that were required to pay into the fund in the bill testimony. These 40 companies will not be able to pass these costs on to consumers because their competitors will not have to pay the one-time penalty and thus will not raise their prices. Second, the bill empowers the Department of the Environment to use the Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Fund to fund cross-agency, local, and state projects that address the impacts of climate change, such as clean energy projects, green transportation projects, emergency management and disaster relief initiatives, and much more. At least 40% of the qualified expenditures from the fund will go directly to projects that directly benefit communities disproportionately affected by climate impacts. There is a list of the funds that will be eligible to receive the funding I have submitted for the record. For example, the Comprehensive Flood Mitigation Fund, the Whole Homes Program, the Statewide Transit Innovation Grant, and the Office of Resilience are among a few. This legislation is not unprecedented. In fact, it's modeled after the legislation that Senator Van Hollen first introduced in Congress. And I'd like to point out to the committee that there is a really fabulous letter from Senator Van Hollen in your testimony. And he talks about a number of really interesting points, but he says the Renew Act is a state-based approach to a proposal I put forward at the federal level, the Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act. Both bills are based on a simple principle used in national Superfund legislation, that companies that have caused harm should bear the cost of repairing that harm, not taxpayers. He goes on to say that there are no Maryland companies among the major polluters, and under economic principles accepted across the ideological spectrum, the cost would not be passed on to consumers. And he goes on to explain why. So that is a fabulous endorsement for this legislation, which I thought you would find interesting. So this legislation is based on similar legislation, such as the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, passed by Congress in 1980, where polluters paid $1.6 billion over a 5-year period to clean up abandoned and uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. The only difference now is that we don't have waste sites, we have the waste in the air. Maryland taxpayers will no longer have to bear the undue burden of costs stemming from issues they did not create. Instead, the Renew Act will mandate that these large corporations that took part in worsening the climate change foot the bill for remediation, mitigation, and adaptations. And with this, I request a favorable report on Senate Bill 958.
Okay, why don't we go down the panel and then we'll open up to Q&A. And I'd like to welcome our friend all the way from the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Antonio Hayes has joined us. Okay, sir, why don't you, everybody's going to be on the 2-minute clock. Okay, so tell us who you are.
My name is Nicholas Johnson. I'm not a climatologist. I'm not an engineer. I'm a guy who owns a handful of furniture stores in Maryland and Delaware. I just wanted to walk you guys through sort of my education through experience in the effects of climate change. I remember precisely waking up in 2003 when Hurricane Isabel came through, and my warehouse is in Fells Point in Baltimore. Put 3 feet of water into my warehouse. I literally lost the contents of that warehouse. In 2016, I can tell you where I was the moment I got the first phone call from Kathleen, who was working in my Ellicott City store, to tell me there was a really bad rainstorm and the roof was leaking badly. I told her to put out some buckets. It's an old building. Everything will be okay. 30 minutes later, she called to tell me that she was going to be all right because the woman who worked with her in the morning was friends with Howard County Fire and Rescue. and they knew that she was there and they were going to come get her next. I can tell you in 2018, I was in the exact same restaurant when I received a call from Kim working in my store asking if it would be okay to shelter 30 to 40 wedding guests who had been at a wedding below my store when the storm hit. I said it couldn't be possible. This is a 1 in 100-year event. And I 1 in 1,000. I learned that it's not 1 in 1,000 years. It's a chance of 1 in 1,000 every year. I also remember later after we reopened, a woman coming into my store looking for the pet store that had been in the basement of the building because she wanted to meet the woman who her son was trying to save when he was swept away. That was Eddie Herman's mother. I feel lucky. I've only lost about $400,000 to these events. Some of my neighbors lost their livelihoods. Several lost their lives. I can tell you the ongoing impacts are customers avoid Ellicott City when rain is forecast. I have employees that work for me that are permanently traumatized by these events. And I can tell you that every single person that I know reaches out to me every time Howard County gets a flood alert. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go down to the next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, Ethan Hunt for the Anne Arundel County Administration. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing locally in Anne Arundel County to respond to climate change. So obviously costly and often devastating floods and storms are hitting our region with increasing intensity. And that's especially true in the city of Annapolis, which has experienced the largest increase in nuisance flooding of any U.S. city experiencing nuisance flooding in the last 50 years. And with more than 500 miles of coastline, Anne Arundel County, while a uniquely wonderful place to live, is also uniquely vulnerable to the threats and effects of climate change. So in 2020, we worked with local, state, and our county council elected officials to create the Resilience Authority of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County, which is the first multi-jurisdictional resilience authority in the nation. And our goal in creating our Resilience Authority was not just to accelerate the pace and scale of climate action, but to ensure that we're prepared to compete for substantial public and private funding to take the burden off of local taxpayers while investing in the future of our county. Over the past 12 months, our Resilience Authority has secured nearly $23 million in state and local and federal funding, and they're actively pursuing right now another $52 million to protect the city and county shorelines, communities, and residents from climate threats. Funding that goes to the Resilience Authority is slated towards infrastructure projects that will address coastal flooding, beach restoration, shoreline erosion, developing green spaces, and supporting conversion of the county fleet to electric vehicles. And these projects are made possible through a combination of sources that include local grants and would include funding that would come with the enactment of this legislation. So we're in a historic moment for resilience building efforts in Anne Arundel County and in the state of Maryland. And at the same time, we're facing an increase in the pace, scale, and impact that climate change is having. And it's greater than anything we've previously confronted. So to ensure that the pace of this intensifying change doesn't outstrip our efforts and current availability, we would urge a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and members of the committee. My name is Jose Coronado Flores, and I'm a policy analyst with the organization CASA. Many of our members live in communities that are extremely vulnerable to climate change, including flood plains. So we urge a favorable report for this important legislation that will address current and future climate change related weather impacts by holding the fossil fuel companies with the largest stakes in the industry accountable for pushing a product that they knew was dangerous for the earth and people. CASA is particularly invested in seeing this bill pass because of the health risks, financial losses, and general dangers that climate change poses to the immigrant and working class community. Funds from the Renew Act would directly augment the state's budget for comprehensive flood management. And in this committee, I have spoken extensively on the real life consequences that inadequate stormwater management can have on communities, specifically in places like East Riverdale and Rockville, where low-income people have been hurt, displaced, and lost all of their possessions. The Renew Act also puts money towards prepping and recovering from severe weather events. We cannot wait for weather to become even more extreme and more people to die or be hurt before making substantial improvements to our response and readiness. The last point I want to convey on flooding and sea level rise is that the Renew Act allocates funds to relocate wastewater treatment plants. The specific wastewater treatment plant in mind is the Patapsco treatment plant in Curtis Bay and Brooklyn Park, which is a community that's overburdened and underserved. With sea level rise, this facility will be underwater. So this bill directs funds directly to helping them relocate or elevate their facilities. Last point I want to make is that the Renew Act finally gives funds to the Office of Minority Health Disparities, considering that the immigrant community are the workers that are outside conducting a lot of this manual labor. Investments in their health is critical. We urge a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. DeMarco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Jamie DeMarco on behalf of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, we urge a favorable report. Climate change is costing Maryland. Hotter hots, wetter wets, and higher tides have very real costs. You've heard on this panel, Howard County is spending $228 million to bore an 18-foot diameter drainage tunnel through granite bedrock to prevent flooding like what you heard. It's the biggest capital expenditure in the history of the county. Annapolis is spending $50 million, $80 million renovating their dock from nuisance flooding. The same thing is happening everywhere across the state. Just earlier today, we heard the story of a facility that used to be in a 100-year floodplain, is now in a 30-year floodplain and needs to be moved at the cost of $40 million to the state. You could throw a dart at the map of Maryland, and wherever it lands, you will find a multi-million-dollar project costing the state funds to adapt to a warmer, wetter world. And these are costs that are contributing to the budget projected shortfall in the state of Maryland, and that every year that we don't pass the Renew Act is another year that Maryland taxpayers are insured to pay 100% of these necessary infrastructure costs. These can't be delayed. If a storm, 9 inches of rain, which used to be a once in a 100-year rain event, is now a once 10-year rain event, washes out a road, that road needs to be replaced immediately. Those costs can't be deferred. Through market competition, we can ensure that this cost will not be passed on to consumers. Only about 40 companies will pay it. There are hundreds of companies that extract and refine oil, all of which has access to Maryland markets. 48% of Marylanders say that they have been personally financially harmed by the impacts of climate change within the past 3 years, according to recent Gonzalez polling. That is why 68% of Marylanders support this policy, and that support stays strong even in purple districts like 29 that we did an intensive poll in. We urge a favorable report. Thank you.
We've got Senator Watson, then Senator Gallion, then Senator Augustine. Senator Watson, you lead off.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for having a conversation with me about this, Mr. DeMarco. Just a couple questions. What if they don't pay? What happens?
I'm glad you asked. So we have a letter from the Attorney General saying that under the full faith and credit clause of the US Constitution, judgments in one state can be enforced in another state. You can't commit a crime in Maryland, go to another state and escape penalty. If we say ExxonMobil, you got to pay us $50 million, and they say, no, thank you. Ultimately, the enforcement mechanism is Maryland could put a lien on their oil refinery in New York. And if they continued to refuse to pay, Maryland could actually seize that asset. All of the 40 companies that would be subject to this have physical assets in the United States. And again, by the letter from the Attorney General, under the full faith and credit clause of the US Constitution, we have the ability to put liens on.
That seems ridiculously unfair. I don't know of any business existing today that we would create a new law and they're automatically subject to some kind of new constraints. But could they theoretically just say, we're not going to serve Maryland anymore?
No, oil is sold on a national basis, on a regional basis. I mean, it's impossible to sort of bar a specific state from your sales.
When the Senator, when you were briefing, you had stated that these companies have guilty knowledge many years that the products that come out of their smokestacks or what have you cause problems with the atmosphere, right? So what would have been the alternative? If they knew it and they stopped, where would we get our energy from?
I think what I said is that they lied, right? So they they denied the science around climate change.
Say they accepted the science. I mean, my point is we have a reliance on these companies, right? We're going to continue having a reliance on these companies, even if we impose this on these companies and they paid us freight. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. We all know that. So my question is, you know, go back several years, what, 2000 or what have you? I don't, let me ask another question. And I can understand Senator Van Hollen having this at a national level. Maryland is a little teeny tiny state. So are you telling me that the emissions that come from the state of Maryland just somehow hover over the state? The jet stream doesn't take, you know, these chemicals or what have you outside of Maryland. They just hover and only cause damage to the state of Maryland?
Absolutely not. That would be ridiculous.
So why are you attributing it, all of these companies, just to the state of Maryland?
Climate change is a global problem. And sorry, slightly distracted there. Climate change is a global problem, which requires a global solution. And this bill is being introduced in several other states at the same time. We're looking for a critical mass.
Has anybody passed it thus far?
There are 5 other states that are doing it now, and we expect some of the states to pass it this year. And the question is, you know, why would we wait? Let me answer your previous question with an example. There are many other instances in which, you know, either at the state or federal level, we've gone after companies who have polluted the environment before. And it's not just at the national level. For example, Maryland has done this with other Superfund sites. The Sand, Gravel, and Stone Superfund in Maryland charged a group of companies, including General Motors and Pfizer, over $50 million. Another example is the Dwyer Property Superfund that held Honeywell as one of the responsible parties, and they made Unilever pay for the remediation. So there's a long history of us going after companies that have caused some type of pollution. The only difference about this is that it's climate change that we're talking about.
My only question, Senator, and I understand the intent. I got it. When we went to visit Conowingo Dam, and we knew that the water flowed down the Susquehanna, and we sat there at the Conowingo and we looked at all that junk, and Conowingo had to bear the brunt of paying for it because we could not attribute that junk to New Jersey, to Delaware, to Pennsylvania, anything upstream. And so my question is, how do you know that what we're seeing in Maryland, if you're going to attribute it to these 100-year, 1,000-year floods, or whatever you call it, are not coming from other states, other locales that have somehow come over here and impacted us?
So the way we chose the 20 companies is based on a scientific analysis, which I'd like to have my colleague Jamie answer.
As the senator said, the bill says any company that's emitted more than 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions cumulatively over the covered period would be subject. So any company that is having to pay is a company that has contributed a meaningful amount to the global problem of climate change.
Thank you.
Senator Gallion, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on my colleague's first question. So I was looking at the list that you provided. Saudi Aramco, Saudi Arabia is like as much as like the next 3 combined. So I'm not sure, how does that work with it being international, where you have, you know, a foreign country that's at the very top of the list by far? How would a state ever get money out of a foreign country like that without this being some kind of like federal legislation?
The country in this instant operates in Maryland like a business, and any company that is doing business in Maryland, Maryland has this authority over. Like the other companies on the list, Saudi Aramco has physical assets in the United States. The enforcement mechanism is the same. And we appreciate that Senator Van Hollen took the lead on this policy, who's one of our lead international experts in the US Senate.
And if they refuse to pay, what happens then? They get sued by the state? How's that work?
As I said, their physical assets that exist in the United States could potentially have a lien put on them.
Okay. the next thing, as we look at the call, I mean, pretty much everybody agrees that the climate is changing. But if you look through history, I mean, you have different eras with, cooling cycles, warmer cycles, big ice age, little ice age, all that stuff. So almost all this that's happened recently is being attributed to climate change, man-made climate change. So my question, I was looking at back through some floods in the 17 and 1800s, and there's a whole list of them. I mean, they have pretty interesting names, a lot of them. Who was at fault for those? We're saying that fossil fuel businesses were at fault, and that's why we're going to try to charge them. Who was at fault for the ones in the 1700s and 1800s?
So I could just speak to Ellicott City, and I don't think you can, it's a global problem, which I said already, but Ellicott City has always flooded in one way or another. It was built as a mill town to use the power of the river, to generate electricity and mill bread. However, in previous years, most of the floods were more natural. They came from the bottom of the river up. In more recent years, we've seen the higher frequency intense storms, which are scientifically proven to be caused by the climate change. And so when you have 9 inches of rain in 2 hours, I mean, that's what causes the top down flooding in Ellicott City. So floods have happened for years, but these more intense storms are definitely driven by climate change.
Referring specifically though to we're now saying this is all attributable to man-made climate change. So how is that different than what happened previously with the climate change? I mean, how can that all be attributed to that is what I'm getting at.
So I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but I'd be happy to try to get back to you with an answer, Senator Gallion.
Okay. Senator Augustine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start with the sponsor. So is Superfund federal?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. You said it that I think you said that there are 5 states who have introduced something akin to this, but have any of them passed this legislation yet?
So I think it's 5 states this year. If you don't mind, I'd like to defer to Jamie DeMarco.
Okay.
It's Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York. New York passed it in the Senate last year, but none of those states have yet passed it into law.
Okay, so none of them have passed it. You all have calculated $9 billion, and you have suggested that you have a mechanism to prevent it from getting passed to Marylanders. How do you think that actually in reality is going to happen? Given that these are for-profit companies who are not in the business of just taking losses just to take losses.
That is a fabulous question, and I asked the same thing myself. So there are over 1,000 companies licensed to transport oil and distribute in the state of Maryland. And each of those distributors are going to buy oil from the producer selling it at the lowest possible cost. So because we're only targeting 20 companies, there are lots of other companies that won't, raise their price. And so they won't be subject to the penalty. If you don't believe my word for it, I mean, if you look in the testimony from Senator Van Hollen, he said the exact same thing. Under economic principles accepted across the ideological spectrum, the cost would not be passed on to consumers. The recovery payments are based on past, not current activity, so they do not impact the ongoing cost of production. They are charged to those with the highest past production, leaving some companies who are not subject to recovery payments as price competitors and rivals for market share. Any attempt to collude to set a higher price would be illegal and unlikely to attract companies who aren't covered by the bill or have lower pro rata payment and market-based incentive to undercut those who raise prices.
Okay. Why is gas more expensive in California than it is in other places?
I have no idea.
Okay, would it possibly be that there are additional costs of doing business there and that those things are passed on to consumers?
I'm neither an atmospheric scientist nor a gasoline economist, Senator, but I'd be happy to get back to you with that answer.
Okay, I mean, I clearly am very concerned about the possibility of passing $9 billion on to Marylanders in a very regressive way, not very targeted in the way that some of these situations are, which are pretty targeted. I mean, Howard County's got some real issues. I get that. We support that. But that's different than the situation in the area that I represent or areas of other parts of the state.
I understand your concern, Senator, and I would imagine that folks said the same thing about the tobacco settlement and the same thing about the opioid settlement years
Yeah, I
ago.
appreciate that. So the thing about the tobacco settlement, which I don't disagree with, is that in the case of the tobacco, would you agree that the tax and that the costs associated with that, which were in fact, there's no evidence that it wasn't passed on, but that it was passed on to people who we had the additional public health aspect for those specific individuals, whereas this would be across essentially everyone? Or are you just saying that all of us who have gas cars are responsible? Is that what this is?
I would say
arguing?
that the impact on the health of climate change disproportionately affects the most vulnerable people in the state of Maryland.
Okay, based on gas cars? Because this is who, as I see the group who you've targeted here, the list are associated with gas. But let me just also ask you this, Senator. The list, although short, I would ask who's not on the list, because it appears as though the list that you have covers a very large percentage of the producers of gas, just based on sort of like taking a cursory look at it, versus those who aren't on the list. It looks like it's a pretty significant group, which gives me concern that there won't be this competitiveness that you've talked about.
As I mentioned, there are hundreds of companies that extract and refine oil, and these are 40. Companies that aren't on the list include Murphy Oil, Wintershell, Impex, YPF, Husky, Bahrain Petroleum Corp, OMV,
So,
Syrian Petroleum,
thank
Noble
you.
Energy.
Thank you for that. If you could give percentages, I would appreciate that, because you have the largest here. So if all of those are a relatively small number, relatively small in their volume, I would appreciate knowing what that is. We are really a regional economy here. So has this been introduced, or where is it for Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and West Virginia?
It has not been introduced in those states.
It has not been introduced in any of those states. Okay. All right, I think I've asked enough.
Senator Lewis Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to direct this question to Mr. DeMarco. I think I heard you say, and I want to verify this, that this restoration fund would be applicable to the case study we heard earlier for the Middletown wastewater treatment plant. One, did I hear you correctly? And two, is that because all wastewater treatment plants would qualify, or the uniqueness of the situation we heard earlier?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The bill does specify the funding could go to help localities relocate, elevate, or retrofit wastewater treatment plants that are vulnerable to flooding. So exactly the bill that you brought to the Senate is exactly the kind of one of many kinds of problems that this bill investments will help to solve.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Watson.
Last question. So the 20 companies that were identified based on the amount of gases released, right? Is that what I heard somebody say?
Yes.
Okay. And so say they pay this fee and decide to, leave Maryland. let's just say they did. You had mentioned that because the industry is all about cost, that other suppliers would go and fill that void, that gap, right? Is that what I heard?
So I don't agree with the whole statement that you made, because I don't think that they will leave Maryland. I think we buy gas regionally, and so therefore the distributors will buy from the lowest priced gas companies.
Right. So I guess my question is, Senator, that could there potentially be a scenario where this top 20, either they reduce their amounts or what have you, that void is filled by other companies who over time start releasing the exact same amounts that we're holding them accountable for. So right now we have, let me put it like this. I believe we have some kind of steady state of usage, steady state. And any player that reduces that void is going to be made up. And even though we may have some players other than the 20 identified who produce something less than the 20, they could potentially increase production or, do what they need to do to reach that same level, yet they would not be held accountable as this first set of 20. Is that a fair statement?
Under the bill, they would not be held accountable during this time frame, but I can't predict what will happen in the future. They could be sued, in future years, or there could be a fee levy against them in future years. I'm gonna also point out that our gas quantity is, we're seeing less cars and more electric vehicles. I mean, our committee spends a ton of time talking about that. So it's also equally possible that the amount of fossil fuels that we use goes down.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, additional questions for this panel? We do have one additional set of witnesses. Okay, thank you, Senator Hester, and to the panel. And the 4 witnesses in person signed up here. They're all signed up favorable. There is some unfavorable written testimony in terms of in person. Jennifer Misrahi, Vinnie DeMarco, Fred Sherlinder Dobb, and finally Cynthia Herrera. Those are the 4 witnesses on the list. And Ms. Sarahi, why don't we start with you? And each of you will be on the 2-minute clock, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Vice Chair and Committee. I'm really delighted to be with you today. My name's Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, and I'm a member of Maryland's Climate Commission. And I did submit written testimony, and that testimony has some links and some documents. So I really encourage you to look at the poll of people who live in Maryland on these issues. I also encourage you to look at the letter from the Attorney General's office, and also links to these 2 books, which are really documenting the systematic, really aggressive campaign of lies that was funded deliberately over decades and decades by the fossil fuel industry, which has systematically tried to undermine our human ability to survive here in Maryland, our lives and our livelihoods in a really systematic way. When we think about this is money coming from people who put profits over human beings and the betterment of our state. As a Maryland Climate Commissioner, one of the things that we're doing is trying to figure out the same things that you're trying to figure out. How do we solve this climate problem in the absence of money? We have a fabulous plan from our governor. That plan is $1 billion a year. That does not include the plan from MDOT, which is additionally very, very expensive. And it does not include any catastrophic event that could happen from severe weather. Where's that money going to come from? It could come from taxes. It could come from bonds. It can come from cap and trade. There are a lot of different things that ultimately, as one of the senators was really concerned about, regressive situations could be very regressive. This situation puts the burden on the people who broke it. When I was a kid, my parents would say, if you break it, you bought it. The fossil fuel industry deliberately deceived us. They break it, they should pay for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One to get on the table. Chelsea, you are.
Thank you. I'm Fred Schrillander-Daub, rabbi with Adat Shalom in Bethesda. We're known as a green synagogue, one of a growing number. And those in my congregation, as in many of yours, care deeply about the planet, their progeny, and the poor. That is to say, creation, future generations, and Maryland's minoritized and marginalized citizens, all uniquely threatened by climate change. Historic harms are already baked in, largely from our wanton fossil fuel use. Even as the science got ever clearer, we know much worse lies ahead. Gonna get Talmudic on you. The Talmud asks, who is wise? And gives two answers, a famous teaching on humility and equality, whoever learns from everyone, just like this hearing, and whoever foresees the consequences of their actions. Large fossil fuel companies have foreseen our dire trend line for decades, but they obfuscated, they stonewalled alternatives that could have gotten us further, deepened their footprint and our dependence, forcing us to spend billions just to partially adapt, much less mitigate. These are our highest priorities. The polluter pays principle is basic fairness. Someone is going to pay, and it should be those most responsible. It has precedent in American law and again in Talmud. Whoever digs a pit and just leaves it, someone's ox falls in, the one who dug it must pay up. The largest oil companies to be held liable under the Renew Act have dug a pit. We've all fallen in. To get out, to get us out, they must pay. So this is the Senate's chance to be prophetic, do something huge for today's Marylanders and tomorrow's. Please center the moral urgency and spiritual clarity of polluters paying by advancing the Renew Act. Thank you.
Okay, the other Mr. DeMarco.
The other one, the less important one. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, and Senator Hester for introducing this bill. Members of the committee, Maryland Citizens Health Initiative supports this bill because the bill includes substantial money to reduce health disparities and climate disparities. You in the Maryland General Assembly have made Maryland one of the leading states on healthcare progress, and Chairman Feldman, one of the leaders in his previous iteration. And as you know, there are measures that you've enacted that are running out of money. In 2021, you enacted the Health Equity Resource Communities Law, which is providing resources to organizations across the state in every single area of our state to reduce health disparities and improve healthcare outcomes. That money runs out in a couple of years. Enacted laws to provide additional subsidies for young people, and which has gotten thousands of new young people enrolled in healthcare. That is running out of money. This law would, in what we think is a very fair and proper way, provide the money to continue that progress. As you know, Maryland is one of the leading states in reducing our uninsured rate from 13% to 6%, saved everybody $460 million in uncompensated care. By working together and with money from measures like this, we can go from 6% to 0% and make quality, affordable health care real for all Americans. And that's why we urge a favorable report on this bill. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you get that down? Okay, tell us who you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair. I'm Cynthia Herrera. I'm with Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, and I'm here in favor of SB 958. Extreme heat and cold, plus poor outdoor and indoor air quality contribute to asthma episodes for over 500,000 adults and children across diagnosed with asthma across our state of Maryland. Extreme weather will only increase this health disparity with more flooding and water infiltration in residential homes that are poorly weatherized and that lead to unhealthy housing conditions such as mold, pests, and other allergens. Extreme heat specifically creates higher energy burdens on low-income housing that have significant energy loss from the lack of weatherization and higher energy consumption from energy inefficient appliances that are forced to operate constantly to combat the higher temperatures. The Renew Act allows polluters to be part of the solution to significantly scale programs such as Maryland DHCD Whole Home Program, among others, which increase energy efficiency but also scale electrification and decarbonization programs, which increase the resiliency in Maryland's housing stock and also provide direct energy benefits related to reductions in energy usage and utility bill costs. A whole house approach and increased resources for these programs are needed to address underlying hazards and structural defects, preventing deferrals of otherwise eligible low-income families from receiving housing interventions, and contributing 40% of the full benefits to low-income families hit first and worst by climate change ensures that this bill pursues an equitable strategy. Lastly, funding mold, poor weatherized homes, roofing repair and replacement, proper gutters, downspouts, drainage, adequate ventilation, and heating and cooling systems are necessary for more resilient homes and in face of extreme weather. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for this panel? Vice Chair Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First off, Rabbi, it's great to see you and welcome to Annapolis. Jennifer, thank you for your service to our state on this important commission. And the poll data was fascinating. So colleagues, I'm just going to read you super quick, just one thing. How concerned are you personally about climate change? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not too concerned, or not at all concerned. 307 people were polled by a Gonzalez pollster. Very concerned, 48.5, almost half. Somewhat concerned, 23.1. So 72% basically of 100% of that demographically appropriate and geographically, balanced. So really interesting data that should be obvious, but we have to take action. Jennifer, can you just tell us one thing that you think is going to move the needle the most that your commission is working on, that this administration is leading the way on?
So first, I want to thank you for pointing out the numbers on the poll. You all are people who get elected. I want to point out that that poll was taken immediately before the recent big storm, before the recent big storm. And so if you were to do that poll again, it would probably be much higher numbers. And I really think that is worth doing. I think one of the things I'm most concerned about in terms of the commission is that we have a tendency in the state to score victories by policy. In other words, you all declare that we're going to decarbonize by a certain day, and you say we're going to put wind farms up by a certain time. Implementing these things is so much harder to do than just, the implementation and the tracking and the monitoring of it is really, really important. And I think that some of the measuring of the progress that we're making and trying to focus on the very short window of time that we have is really, really vital. The other thing that's really vital is my concern that we're not coming fast enough with ways to pay for all the things that we know that we have to do. And if we don't pass the Renew Act, and if we don't pass some of the other funding mechanisms, we're not going to hit any of the targets that you all have already passed, our Maryland laws. And that deeply, deeply concerns me.
So again, Jennifer, one thing that you think is going to move the needle the most?
Well, Chairman Feldman is also on the commission, but I think money at the end of the day is going to be the most important thing because you get what you pay for. And if every bill you're looking at the fiscal notes and trying to figure out how can we do it more cheaply until we're not doing it at all, we're never going to meet our goals in terms of all the different ways that we can fund the monumental urgent needs that we have. The Renew Act, which Senator Hester has bravely and boldly introduced, is the very simple, best way to make sure it is not on the backs of the innocent people of Maryland who did not cause this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vinny and Carolyn, Herrera, Ms. Herrera, Mr. DeMarco, thank you. I wasn't trying to treat you all as chopped liver there. I wanted to address the others. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Augustine.
I just want to follow up on the poll question since you thought it was important. Should we work on things based on polls or based on facts?
I think we have to do both. One of the things that also concerns me as we think about the polls and the facts is that one of the things that the polls show us is that the public does not know about the wonderful incentives offered by the federal government in terms of EVs, heat pumps, solars, et cetera. There are billions of dollars in cash and prizes that our state government needs to apply for our state, but frankly, the individual consumers, all of your constituents should be taking advantage of these subsidies to help them electrify, and they don't really know about it. So one of the things that money would be spent on in the state climate plan is simply public education to let people in Maryland know about federal incentives to help them electrify their homes. And when they do that, they will save money because having heat pumps or having EVs is going to be $3,000 in cost savings per family on average per year.
It's not your poll, but I'm curious why, well, actually, I think I do know why Legislative District 29 would be in this poll. Do you think polls should be used for intimidation?
Oh, I don't think it was done for intimidation. I think it was done because this particular district, because this country and this state has become so hyper polarized and partisan that it is really important to look at the people in the middle, to really look at the swing, to not just think that everything happens in a Democratic or Republican primary, but to look at the swings, the moderate middle, the people who are struggling to make ends meet and are terrified that if there's a hard rain and their house floods, they don't have that money to fix that. They can't even afford sometimes the sandbags. I mean, it's just really, really tough out there for people in the moderate middle. And I think that's exactly why they picked that district, is to really talk to the common person in the middle.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions for the panel? Okay, seeing none, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 958. And we're gonna next go back to Senator Hester for Senate Bill 683. And Senator, we have one witness, well, actually, yeah, one witness, Justin Bowers from DNR, who is signed up, and we're gonna, Mr. Bowers, if you want to come up here, and you are signed up favorable. And Senator Hester, Senate Bill 683.
Thank you, Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and members of the committee. I'm here today to talk about SB 683, Tree Expert License Renewal Fee. You may remember a similar bill from last year. We heard testimony regarding the dangerous nature of the tree trimming industry, not just to those who work in the field, but also to the environment and to the consumer when tree care is performed improperly. A significant cause for the concern has been the lack of oversight, putting workers and landowners at risk. We found out that this is due in part to the Department of Natural Resources' slow response time to complaints submitted because of the lack of staffing, a common government problem. Last year, the Maryland Arborists Association expressed their concern with a provision in SB 586, which limited the number of companies that an individual's license could be listed under. After extensive meetings with DNR and industry members, we have drafted a bill that addresses the same problem we attempted to tackle last year, but this time with support from all the stakeholders involved. So basically what the bill does is it's amended to raise the cap on application, license, and renewal fees for tree expert licenses. By allowing DNR to increase the fee, we provide necessary funding for them to bring on desperately needed staff to implement a forest and tree service program that is effective, reliable, and informative. My office has also offered an amendment to the committee that I would specify a cap on the cost of application and renewal fees by DNR. And I respectfully request a favorable report on Senate Bill 683.
Okay, Mr. Bowers, why don't you weigh in here and then we'll take questions.
Sure. Good evening, Chairman, Vice Chairman, and members of the EEE Committee. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Senator Hester, for championing this bill. My name is Justin Bowers, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Maryland Forest Service. The Licensed Tree Expert Law is perhaps the most important regulatory instrument that we have at the state level to ensure that industry best practices are followed and that high-quality tree care is normalized across the state of Maryland. By requiring professionals to meet certain experiential criteria and pass a rigorous exam administered by the Department of Natural Resources, licensure promotes a business environment where practitioners are held accountable for their responsibilities that they hold to the customer, the resource, and to the industry as a whole. The amendments put forth in this bill requiring the licensed tree expert to carry and provide the Forest Service with a copy of their company's workers' compensation policy and strengthening the unit's authority to set fees that would help us operate the program in a cost-effective manner are vital to meeting the intent of the statute and to expanding the culture of good tree care practices in the state. The Maryland Forest Service strongly encourages a favorable report for SB 683, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the time.
Okay, any questions for the sponsor or for Mr. Bowers? Okay, seeing none, that concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 683. Brings us to the next Senator Hester bill. We're going to go to Senate Bill 835, and we've got a panel. I'm going to call up Lori Graff if she's here. I don't actually see her. Krista McGee, Cindy Skalny, and I don't know if Les Knapp is here from MDE, but he is signed up. In any event, Senator Hester, Senate Bill 835.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Chair Feldman, Chair Kagan, members of the committee. I'm still Senator Katie Fry Hester. This time I'm here to ask for your consideration of Senate Bill 835, which will require well and septic programs with delegated authority to submit data surrounding permit turnaround times to the Department of the Environment. Since 2021, this committee has heard numerous bills aimed to address the problems associated with well and septic permitting programs. They are the septic systems themselves are time-intensive and costly pieces of the construction process for Maryland homeowners and small businesses, often costing upwards of $10,000. Their permits are overseen by the Maryland Department of the Environment, but they're delegated to local health departments, which sometimes face challenges related to staffing, customer service, and work quality. So last year, we passed legislation that required the Department of the Environment to submit a report on the structure and performance of the delegated authority. It gets delegated from the Maryland Department of the Environment to the local health departments. The report found that the existing delegation leads to issues with consistency, interpretation, timing, understanding, oversight, and accountability. Additionally, it found that the average time for the approval of permits varies from 1 day to 1 month, often without adequate and consistent communication between our local health departments and permit applicants. So in order to increase the consistency and effectiveness of the permitting process, the Department of the Environment must have accurate data. Therefore, Senate Bill 835 will simply require each local delegated authority to submit a schedule for well and septic permit review times to the Department of the Environment for approval. Once the basic schedule has been approved, a delegated authority must submit well and septic permit data to the department for review. It's important to note that this bill does not create a mandatory permit turnaround time or impose a one-size-fits-all solution. However, it does ensure that the department will have critical data on permit turnaround times to evaluate the performance of our local programs. Otherwise, the department cannot make an honest assessment about whether each program is meeting the needs of local constituents and providing the best customer service possible. Given our focus on the housing agenda this year, colleagues, I would argue that this bill is incredibly important, as if you're not on public water, having a well and septic permit for new construction is incredibly important across the state. This simple bill is a critical next step to ensure that when we do delegate authority, customer service is still monitored at the state level. SB 835 provides a basic yet meaningful mechanism to promote accountability and transparency in well and septic permit turnaround times. And for these reasons, I would respectfully request a favorable report on Senate Bill 835.
Okay, why don't we go, and why don't you pull that mic close to you and tell us who you are. And Les Knapp, I called you. You want to come up to the table as well? And then are you from the builders or who are you?
No, Howard County Council.
Okay, very good. Okay, we've got all the witnesses. Okay, Ms. McGee, you go next.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is Krista McGee, and I am here on behalf of Maryland Realtors. And we are requesting your support of Senate Bill 835, which would establish reporting requirements for local septic permitting processing times. The septic approval process and the operations of the local health departments regarding these septic inspections have been a concern for real estate professionals and their clients for several years. The delays in receiving necessary permits and inspections, as well as changing standards, have led to delays in real estate transactions and even cancellations of contract for purchase. In our discussion with these local health departments, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and elected officials, one impediment to better operations is a lack of uniform information on septic activities in the state. It is difficult to determine whether inspection and processing delays are occurring statewide or just regional anomalies. Senate Bill 835 is a necessary first step to developing that system and providing accountability for timely processing of permit applications and inspections. And if reporting determines that timely processing is not occurring, this will allow the state to look back at alternative approaches to the current system. Based on the growing impacts that septic system approvals and inspections are having on the industry, realtors urge great oversight of this process and therefore are asking your for support of Senate Bill 835. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Knapp, why don't you go next?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Les Knapp on behalf of the Maryland Department of the Environment here in support of Senate Bill 835 and the concept of its reporting requirements. Data transparency is a core principle of both MDE and the Moore administration. And in this session, Governor Moore has introduced the Transparent Government Act of 2024, and that's going to require all state agencies to categorize their permits and provide target turnaround times. This bill would apply similar principles for well and septic permitting to local delegated authorities. You need the core data, such as your permit turnaround times, in order to establish a baseline and to evaluate the performance of your permitting program. Without it, you cannot address challenges as they rise or over the long term gauge its success and performance. So, as was noted, this bill does not mandate a targeted turnaround time because that does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction for valid reasons. We don't believe it imposes any type of costly burden on a local health department or county government that has received the delegation, as this is fairly basic information that they should and do know. Finally, I will note that there may be some alternatives, though, to the reporting requirement included in the bill, such as right now, we have updated all of the delegation agreements that will go out to local jurisdictions. This has been several years in the making. And with this new modern updated agreement, Cecil County government was the first to sign on, but every jurisdiction that receives a delegation, we expect to be signed on by the end of this year. That could be done in lieu of having a separate reporting requirement as the bill envisions. But we certainly will be happy to work with the sponsor and the bill, and we certainly support the concept of having this data. So with that, urge a favorable report and thank you.
Okay, and Howard County.
Feel like it's going to slide away from me. Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Scowney. I serve as Chief of Staff for Councilman David Youngman in Howard County, and I'm testifying in support of SB 835. Our office handles dozens of constituent complaints regarding septic permitting and regulation every year. Complaints include outdated rules and standards, lack of flexibility, and long inconsistent processes. We support this bill, which establishes a process for the collection of meaningful data on the timeframes involved in granting well and septic permits. It is our hope that this information provides comparative insight to ensure consistent responsiveness and decision-making, and to ease transactional business with the local health departments in each of our counties. We also believe the bill could be further strengthened and afford our local health department the necessary clarity by one, reviewing current flow rates in the code and establishing criteria to deviate from them. Many proposed uses do not fit perfectly into existing definitions. Additionally, modern appliances and plumbing fixtures that generate less wastewater are readily available. Current requirements frequently limit the best and most effective use of properties, even when the actual wastewater result ends up being below stated acceptable levels. And number two, reviewing the circumstances that should require system upgrades. We've seen many cases when a resident is building an addition that does not impact wastewater flow or adds a bedroom that falls within the approved capacity of the current documented system specifications, only to get caught up in an arduous process and costly system upgrades. Amending this bill to consider these issues could lead to changes that improve the process for our constituents. We hope all of you will support this bill and consider the additions we've suggested. Thanks again to Senator Hester for focusing on these issues.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for MD, Mr. Knapp. So you made reference to what Cecil County is doing. I know you and the secretary were out in the interim, and I had a chance to go to that meeting there at Great Wolf Lodge. You didn't get to go on the rides or anything when you were there, but you did come
Neither
out
did
for the
we.
meeting room. So we appreciate that.
Yes.
So can you kind of explain like how that all ties together with what, briefly say like what Cecil's doing a little differently and how this ties together with this bill?
So, yes, so in Cecil County, their health department had a number of challenges running the well and septic permitting program. And the decision was made to transfer that authority from the local health department, which is a kind of semi-autonomous independent unit. It's not actually part of county government, even though they're called county health departments, to the actual county government. And this was the first time a transfer of this nature has happened in many, many years. So it was time for a fresh look about how to do that. As that was transferred over, this gave MDE the potential to look at the delegation agreements, some of which had not been updated in decades, and to completely rewrite it from the ground up, which was done for Cecil, and that will serve as a template moving forward. So now the government has signed that, they're running the program, you know, they have taken some baby steps, and overall the performance is improving, and we haven't had any major challenges with it as they are continuing to ramp up with the experience of doing that program.
Okay, Senator Carosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Knapp, I'm going to ask you to kind of take a step back because those of us who have been dealing with ongoing septic challenges in our counties for years have tried to untangle a number of issues. So first of all, from an organizational standpoint, my first question is, it's caused a lot of confusion that you have, you know, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and then you've got the local health departments, you know, that run the septic programs, and they're state employees, but they're referred to as county offices. And on the ground level with constituents, if it's confusing for us here, you can imagine the complexity and the confusion it causes at the you know, at the local level. So my first question is, can you just first of all do a walkthrough? Because as I understand, counties have options on how they're organized, like Worcester and Wycomico are different. And then from the standpoint of, I think, trying to get a handle on, you know, a process that has been extremely frustrating for all involved, from homeowners to, you know, the businesses, to both the county and the state employees that are involved in the program. So I'm going to ask you just first to take that step back and kind of explain the organizational structure, how different counties have different approaches, and maybe contrast Worcester and Wycomico as an example. And then, you know, what this legislation actually does to improve the current situation. And then my follow-up question is, since you've been kind enough to specifically come down to Wycomico County on several occasions, I'd like to better understand how this legislation would impact the situation in Wycomico County.
Okay, I'll try to briefly summarize. So the authority to do well and septic permitting vests with the Maryland Department of the Environment at the state level. We have the authority under state law to delegate that authority out to either a local health officer, the head of the local health department, or a county government that meets the requirements to essentially enforce environmental laws. So those are kind of your two options. There is a third option, which would be MDE takes the delegation back or it's returned to us, and then we run the program at the state level for a local jurisdiction. One challenge we have with that right now is we cannot charge an application fee to do that. So that is actually being addressed in our departmental bill, which is over in the House and will be coming over to this committee, hopefully, after crossover. And you'll get to consider that piece.
And before you go on to the next piece, of the 24 jurisdictions, how would it break down in those three different categories?
So right now, MDE, while we assist or heavily run certain programs or have stepped in as a triage, like we did for a while in Wycomico, we don't run any local well and septic permitting program at the moment formally. I believe I think it's 6 counties, governments actually run it, and the rest are all the local health departments. And
Okay, so Worcester is an exception in that 6.
Worcester is in a smaller group. So it's like Worcester, now Cecil, Montgomery, and I think there might be 1 or 2 others. I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, so thank you for that explanation. So now when you take the situation in Wycomico, which is still extremely urgent, how does this legislation address the challenges that they're facing in Wycomico County?
It doesn't.
So this particular bill probably would not specifically do that. More broadly, this is a data reporting bill. So it gives us data to kind of help moving forward to evaluate and analyze the local programs.
So given that Wycomico County is a county that has the local health department, which are still state employees running this, what does it mean for their day-to-day, as well as the property owners and businesses that are involved in the whole septic process?
Well, I think as Ms. McGee noted, having that data available in a public format so that everybody kind of understands, in this jurisdiction, an average permit turnaround time would be X, kind of gives you at least some baseline of what to expect.
So meaning Wycomico County's health officer, would be responsible for the well and septic program in Wycomico County, that office would be required to provide these timelines to MDE.
Yes, under the bill. And as I was saying, as we go with these revised delegation agreements, that's going to be automatically built in. So in order to receive the delegation, they have to sign this agreement. One of the requirements in that agreement is you have to report this data and other data as well to MDE. Ultimately, we want to move to a uniform permit application system hosted at the state level for every local jurisdiction that would account for local differences if you needed specific data for a certain county due to local practices. But we would then have that data, and as part of our environmental tracking system, ETS, anybody could log on and see the status of where that permit is. In some jurisdictions, you can do that now very well. Others, that's a little more of a struggle.
So would this bill, is this to address the excessive delays? Is that the purpose of this bill?
This would give us the data to start that evaluation, yes, and to identify where are there challenges, and then if there are delays, what's causing those delays?
Okay, thank you.
Senator Carosa, could I just try to answer your question? So this is, I mean, I've been working on this delegation of authority for trying to understand it for like 4 years. And I'm so happy that, that you seemed interested in this topic along with me. When we passed Senate Bill 830, it required this report, which it included in my testimony. And this is only the interim report. So it identified the problems with the delegation, which are consistency, timing, oversight, and accountability, but it didn't address the answer. So there's a final report that's coming out in December where we're going to get, I think, more answers about how to actually fix it going forward. But this bill is like a small piece of the puzzle, so we can try to see where the excessive times are.
Thank you for that. And you're right. I think any of us who have delved into this, it's an extremely frustrating process. And we've been trying to figure out both, I mean, in our case in Wycomico County, we have brought in the Chamber of Commerce, we brought in the county government, you know, our state folks that are involved. It's been a full court effort. And it seems to me, for instance, to really understand this process and to improve it, you need the feedback from the local health officer, as well as in the counties where those 6 counties where it has been, you know, there's a different arrangement, because they're on the front lines and can tell us exactly either, you know, where their roadblocks are. So does this bill allow for that feedback from those who unfortunately have had to live through this, but may have good recommendations to improve the current process?
My understanding is that this bill will start that conversation. If they look at like Howard County and they see that Howard County has excessive timelines, then MDE can call up Howard County and say like, hey, how can we help solve the issue that you're having here? But it's only one small piece of the puzzle. I don't think we've cracked the nut yet.
And I guess I'm going to go back to Mr. Knapp, because you've actually have been in those painful meetings in Wycomico County. And some of what I think the intention of this bill, you were trying to do, you know, at a state level representing MDE. Is this going to be a tool that can then help address the overall issues that we're having at the local level?
So yes, I do think this is an important part of getting this data in one form or another, however the reporting mechanism works, to have this data to be able to get those baselines and establish, okay, here's your baseline, then you can evaluate a program. And this is an important step that's needed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any additional question? I'm sorry, any additional questions for the panel? Okay. That concludes bill hearing on Senate Bill 835, which brings us to the final Hester bill and the final bill of the day for this committee, Senate Bill 956. And I'll just call up some folks who have signed up, or unless you have it designated. We do have, but here I see Emily Scarr. Let's call her up.
And Brent Walls.
Brett Walls is virtual though.
And MD is here to answer questions.
Okay, Brett Walls is not in the queue, and he's supposed to be virtual. And then we've got Doug Myers, Emily Scarr, Mike Sanderson. You want to just come up? I know you're favorable with amendments, Mike, but let's just get the extent of the witnesses here. Diana Ignor, is Miss Ignor here? Okay, don't see her. And then we do have one virtual. Well, we have Jeremy Baker. Why don't you stand back? You want to come? Yeah, come on up. You're favorable with amendment. And then we have one virtual witness for information purposes only. And then that'll be it. So Senator Hester, let's start with you, Senate Bill 956.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for your consideration of Senate Bill 956, Protecting State Waters from PFAS Pollution Act. Since the Maryland Department of the Environment produced the PFAS action plan and briefed the committee on January 30th, we've been working closely to outline the next steps in the regulatory process. As a result of those conversations, we have agreed to a consensus amendment that strikes the bill as introduced and instead creates a timeline and process to empower MDE to develop standards and plans for continuing their work regulating PFAS. I just wanted to get that on the table because I think the bill in your file and the massive amount of unfavorable testimony will probably be alleviated by the amendment. So with that said, before we get to what the bill will do, I'd like to remind the committee that during the briefing on January 30th, we were informed that PFAS causes significant health risks. And during that hearing, MDE provided an update on its monitoring of all the 437 public water systems that have that to address the PFAS contamination. In 63 of these systems, the maximum contaminant levels for PFAS exceeded the levels proposed by the EPA, which are set at the draft level of 4 parts per trillion. Now, of these 63 systems, 14 are in the process of being awarded $40 million to address that contamination. However, we must continue to address the remaining 49 systems and prevent future contamination. And we're constrained, obviously, by the amount of funding that we have. If it took $40 million to address these 14 systems, we have $80 million left from the federal government, and that's likely not enough for the 49 systems that remain. If you're curious where these 49 systems are, I have attached a table with a list by county to my testimony. So during the briefing, you may recall that we delved into the intricacies of the PFAS action plan. Section 5.6 of the plan states that MDE will incorporate new permit requirements for industrial discharges with reasonable potential to violate the water quality for PFAS. And during the hearing, MDE confirmed their intention to update the significant industrial user permits to encompass regulations over the discharge of PFAS. So with all that context, where we have gotten to is that we're working on an amendment, and as the amendment that basically strikes the original bill, as the amendment is being drafted, it will require MDE to work collaboratively with the publicly owned treatment works and significant industrial users with pre-treatment permits to identify the facilities that are currently and intentionally using PFAS chemicals. The point of this identification is to prevent the industrial users from further contaminating our water systems. MDE will then develop monitoring and testing criteria for those facilities. It will work with the publicly owned treatment works and significant industrial users to develop action plans and mitigation plans for addressing the PFAS contamination. After they have these action plans, they would develop a standard MCL for discharge of individual PFAS that are known to be harmful, as well as total PFAS. They will produce an interim report or update the PFAS action plan with progress made against these requirements. So all that to say is that this is our next step in protecting the water, the drinking water for the state of Maryland. The water quality is not a policy choice. It's a non-negotiable commitment to the health and safety of our communities. And the PFAS, the Protecting State Waters from PFAS Pollution Act, as amended, is an essential next step to advance our state's public health and clean water, and it's necessary to avoid millions of dollars of damage from future PFAS discharge. For these reasons, I respectfully request a favorable report, and I will get you the amendment as soon as possible.
Hey, Mrs. Baker, why don't you, we'll go down the road here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Jeremy D. Baker on behalf of the Department of the Environment. Senator, just wanted to thank you for your extensive conversations with us and continuing to work with us as we look to, find a way forward to address PFAS contamination. I think the senator summed it up pretty well. So I'll just say that the point of the amendment is so that MDE can arrive at a scientifically defensible process for PFAS mitigation. The bill as drafted doesn't really give us the time and deference to do that, but with the amendments that we've come up with, we think that it allows us to, come up with that defensible, legally sufficient process. Additionally, it would allow MDE to work with the publicly owned treatment works, the significant industrial users to work together and incorporate PFAS standards into both the permitting and the enforcement processes. So accordingly, MDE asked for a favorable with amendments report.
Mrs. Sanderson, you want to go next?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Michael Sanderson with the Maryland Association of Counties. We submitted testimony support with amendments. I'll shift from that a little bit in light of if this bill is going to turn into a new set of amendments and a different view. Frequently, I sit here and put on the glasses and ask you to find a line in the bill and that sort of with me, but I'm going to leave the glasses off and just say, if the plan is to let's come together with some overall regime for what to do about PFAS in a variety of places, it's concerning in a variety of ways, and we're still learning how to test for it and measure it and mitigate it and so forth. I think the core principle in this bill that's before you is basically a polluter pays concept. And I think philosophically, that makes a lot of sense. If the definition of the significant industrial user ends up including your local wastewater system or ends up including your local landfills and rubble fills, I think we're differently situated than a manufacturer where these chemicals are the byproduct of their business and they're the ones generating the problem. Local governments are the receivers of the problem. It comes to us in the public water. It comes to us in the municipal solid waste stream. Those facilities are already under the thumb of the department, in all candor. So I think we're already in a reasonable regime on that part. I'm not saying we absolutely need to be no part of anything that's considered in a revised version of this bill. But if you want to move forward with this kind of vision, I would encourage you. Public facilities, I think, are different than industrial and manufacturers who are generating the stuff. And with that in mind, I think we would be productive contributors on going forward.
Okay, Ms. Scar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Emily Scar. I'm the Director of Maryland PIRG, here in support of SB 956 with sponsor amendments. In 2022, the General Assembly and this committee passed the George Walter Taylor Act with overwhelming bipartisan support to restrict the use of cheap PFAS chemicals in this bill. It's a logical next step. The best way to address PFAS contamination is to prevent it in the first place. And according to Maryland's PFAS action plan released in December, 14% of Maryland industries that responded to a survey reported having PFAS on site. Some states have passed or are considering comprehensive legislation to phase out all PFAS use with limited exemptions, and Maryland should be wise to consider joining them in future years. But for the time being, we should do everything we can to keep industries from sending PFAS contaminated water to our wastewater treatment plants or into our ecosystem. The EPA has made clear that states can restrict PFAS discharges under the Clean Water Act. And moreover, existing pollution control technology can capture roughly 99% of PFAS and wastewater. So we're grateful to Senator Hester for her leadership on this issue and the staff of MDE for working to figure out a way forward. The amendments the sponsor put in, well, it should help prevent Maryland taxpayers and families from paying for the cost of new PFAS contamination with our health in our pocketbooks. As the MDE surveys have found, contamination levels in most of our drinking water is low, but they still pose risks to our health, especially for children, because according to the EPA, there's no safe level of some PFAS in drinking water. Accordingly, as the senator mentioned, the EPA has proposed new strict limits for some PFAS in drinking water. And moving forward, we're glad that this bill smartly directs MDE to take a dual approach to setting MCLs for both some PFAS as well as total PFAS. So let's do our best to get ahead of this problem so we can minimize the harm to our health and the environment. We recommend a favorable report.
Okay, Mr. Myers.
Thank you, Chair, Co-Chair, members of the committee. My name is Doug Myers, Maryland Senior Scientist, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. In addition to what you've heard before, I'm going to speak for the critters today. PFAS is thousands of different chemicals. Generally, they're occurring in limits that are barely detectable. This bill understands that EPA is not on top of this yet. They're struggling to keep up. All the states are struggling to keep up with this issue. And from the standpoint of the Bay, imagine an oyster. An oyster can concentrate almost any chemical, any heavy metal, any organic pollutant to 15,000 times, whatever the ambient concentration is. And despite what you may have heard from the Supreme Court, I believe our drinking water, our groundwater, and our surface waters are hydrologically connected. And so PFAS is getting into the Bay. Those oysters are fed upon by a number of different predators. For example, flatworms. Flatworms are fed on by crabs and fish. And so our circle of life is bringing those PFAS back to us, whether or not it's directly in our drinking water. So I urge folks to realize that the program that we're attempting to establish here, and I really do thank the sponsor and MDE for doing the best we can with the incomplete science we have around PFAS being able to be detected at higher concentrations than it's actually having a biological effect. And that's a very difficult technical problem to deal with. So I encourage everybody to continue the work on this. I think this bill is a very good first step, and it's the most comprehensive PFAS bill this body has heard. And I'm really urging your support with amendments as described. Thank you.
Okay, well, Mr. Walls did pop into the queue, virtual witness. Mr. Walls, you've got 2 minutes and you're signed up favorable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the members of the committee. My name is Brett Walls. I'm for Potomac Riverkeeper with Potomac Riverkeeper Network. I'm here today to advocate for a favorable report on SB 956. It's a crucial bill that seeks to protect public wastewater facilities and the impacts of PFAS pollution originating from industry. This legislation is a necessary step to ensure that the burden of cleaning up PFAS pollution does not fall on the shoulders of the public and our valuable wastewater utilities. PFAS, I'm sure as many of you are aware now, are toxic chemicals that have been widely used in industrial processes and consumer products for decades. These persistent and harmful chemicals have been found in water supplies in communities across the country and in Maryland, posing serious health risks to those who consume contaminated water. Let's be clear, wastewater treatment plants are a source of PFAS. I have monitored many wastewater treatment plants. MDE has monitored these facilities, and the data shows a significant impact to Maryland rivers. The data also shows that public wastewater systems that have industry as a significant source of waste have higher PFAS levels. And these industries must have some sort of a pre-treatment for PFAS. I've collected samples at a number of facilities and have tested them myself and have shown that these levels of PFAS not only are in the water, but they're also in the fish that are in those same streams. And in those same communities are a lot of subsistence fishermen that rely on those fish to feed their families. And when you have industry that is discharging into a publicly owned treatment works, and that's then discharging into the rivers, it's having this cycle effect of impacting a lot of different communities, especially environmental justice communities. So I am urging a favorable report on this so we can get ahead and assess what's the real situation is. Thank you.
Any questions for Senator Hester, the panel, or virtual witness on this piece of legislation? Okay, seeing none, and our other virtual witness is not in the queue. So that concludes our bill hearing on Senate Bill 956, and that concludes our work for today. And I will thereby declare this bill hearing